Am I on? Yes, I'm on. Okay, we're going to call to order the March 19 meeting of the Independent Ethics Board for the City of Tallahassee. First thing I would like to do is introduce our new board member appointed by the Public Defender, Shanor Grewal, and recognize you for whatever comments you would choose to make, ma'am. You just have to talk into the microphone.
Okay, there we go. I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here tonight, and I look forward to hopefully doing some great work on this board.
We welcome you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next would be the approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which I think everybody has seen. Anybody have any comments, questions, edits, or additions? Ms. McNeil, before she got up, moved the adoption of the minutes, and Ms. Graham seconds. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. And the minutes are adopted. Can I get a quick idea of who we have here that are applicants for the empty board seat? I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. And applicants for the board attorney? Apparently 1. Oh, two. Okay. The first thing that we are going to do is the selection of the new board member. And I want to stress to people, we had a meeting in February where we had narrowed the list of board member applicants, and we had selected a board attorney. Because of our failure to have a quorum, everything we did, the discussion, everything that we did at that meeting is null and void. We are starting over. So in terms of both the selection of the new board member and the board council, we are starting from ground zero. We have the full list of applicants before us. In this case, it's 19 applicants for the board member and 8 applicants for the board council. And we should, no one should feel bound in any way by what has happened previously. This is a brand new selection starting from scratch. So as long as everybody's clear on that, and that's not me making that up, I think that's where legally we have to be. So on the board member, what I would like to do is follow the same procedure that we used the last time. First, I'll recognize anybody who wants to speak, applicants or anyone else in the audience who wants to speak to the selection of the board member. Then it would be my intention to go through and ask each current member of the board who their top couple choices are, whether it's 1, 2, 5, whatever. And that hopefully will help us narrow the list, because I realize 20 or 19 people is probably too many to compare. We need to get it down to a smaller number. Okay. And I note that Mr. Smith is walking in the back right now, so we have all 6 members here. So anyone in the public who wishes, not an applicant, who wishes to speak to the selection of the new board member? Okay, then as I recall, we had 5 applicants, and I would recognize, let's do ladies first, and I'll just let you guys come to the podium and arm wrestle for who gets to talk. And so if you want to come to the podium and in any of the 5 applicants, and we'll recognize you for whatever comments you would like to make. I would ask you probably not to go on for 15 minutes, but other than that, you're good. And you need to pull that mic down and talk into it, please.
Hey, I'm Chrissy Moore, and I am one of your applicants. I am the founder of the Florida Autism Center. So we serve mostly children with early intervention around the state. We have about 35 offices in Florida and 8 offices in Georgia. I am also on the compliance committee for a very large autism provider in Texas. So most of the work that I have done previously that would be relevant here is work on compliance, working with governing bodies, making sure that we are in line with the regulations for billing and all those good kind of things. And I just want to serve in our community and be helpful, and that's why I'm here today. So thank you for considering me as an applicant, and I guess that's all. Thank
Okay, any questions of Ms. Moore?
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you for the work you do. That's important. social service background right now has my heart beating a little
Right.
faster.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Julia Trammell, and I'm one of the applicants. My background is I'm in the medical field. I'm the program director at Kaiser University. I teach the medical assistant program, and one of the reasons this attracted me was because we teach ethics in our courses, and it's a big thing to me for everybody to be ethical. And when I saw this, I thought, why not? Don't know a lot about government, so I didn't. But I'm willing to learn, and that's why I'm here. So this way, hopefully, I can be a part of this team. And we all try at Kaiser as faculty and members, try to get involved in our community. And I'm new to Tallahassee, so been here less than 2 years. So, and thank you for considering me. Right?
Okay, questions for Ms. Trammell?
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And you certainly came to Tallahassee for 2 years of interesting ethics conversations. Okay, next up. And I guess you're on deck.
Good afternoon. I'm John Clark. This is the third meeting I've been to in seeking this, and as you said, nothing transpired really that stuck in the first two. Nevertheless, I persisted. It's a good question. Why would someone want to serve on this board? Because I think it's probably a thankless job. Since 1960, I've had an abiding interest in and been a student of politics and government. I know that's before some of you were born. I've managed several successful campaigns, including for the State House and Congress. I've worked for the state for several years in the Department of Elections, and I've run a congressional office, the district office for at least 11 years for a former congressman. So I understand the give and take of government and politics firsthand. I know that most of the people that work for government are hard workers, but sometimes are ethically challenged and need guidance and direction. I think we've hit a rough patch here in Tallahassee the past few years. So I want to serve not to catch somebody doing something, but to mold attitudes and minds of those that we would work with. I want the right decision to be second nature to the people that are serving. I want them to never have to worry about having done something they're going to be caught on or found out. I want them to be like Caesar's wife, beyond reproach or suspicion. I want them to honor the spirit as well as the letter of the laws and the ethics code. I believe we have to emphasize training and education rather than enforcement. I served 35 years after working in a congressional office as a financial advisor. It's what used to be called a stockbroker, but I was a manager for 11 years of a major New York stock exchange firm here in town. It's a very heavily regulated industry. We have internal regulations, state of Florida, NASD, and the New York Stock Exchange. Our office was subject to surprise audits at all times. We had one every year, and we passed every single one with flying colors. I also served as an NASD arbitrator. In my job, I was in charge of all the regulation for the office, the enforcement of the office, regulation, the rules of the New York Stock Exchange, the NASD, and managed a multi-million-dollar budget, as well as hired and supervised the staff and handled my own clients. As I retired at the end of this year, I was in charge of a team that managed $1 billion in assets. My references include a FSU dean, bank president, and a retired Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. I'd consider it a distinct honor and privilege to serve. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Clark? Seeing none, thank you.
Thanks.
Next, yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Dennis Barton. I live at 924 Hillcrest Court here in Tallahassee. I do not offer services to the city, nor, although I greatly respect them, run for office. So in that regard, that's that. I think the ethics board is extremely important. I've got a lifetime experience in ethics. My entire career was spent with either the Florida Engineering Society as their executive director, or the Florida section of the American Society of Civil Engineers, or the Board of Professional Engineers, all of which have very strong either codes of ethics or rules of professional conduct. As the CEO, I was responsible for determining legal sufficiency of complaints, running the probable cause panels, investigating, hiring investigators. I never actually did any investigating. And then, carried the process out. So to that extent, I know and understand ethics. I agree with the previous speaker. A very important aspect of ethics is ethics training and information. You want to develop a culture. One of the things the engineers did and they've had codes of ethics for many, many years and hit on them pretty hard. And they develop a sense of ethics, so it was never a shock when they signed the 3-page document indicating they would comply. So to that extent, if I can be helpful on the board with my experience in ethics, I'd appreciate a chance to serve. Any questions?
Any questions, Mr. Barton? I would disclose that I have known Mr. Barton off and on since the days when we did sunset reviews in the legislature.
I was hoping you hadn't remembered.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair, honorable board members, my name is Brady Augustine, and I come before you today for the open seat on the Independent Ethics Board. I am just a citizen. I live on the north side on Ulysses Road, and I don't bring any particular insight, and I have no political motivations. The reason why I'm here is because I want to get back to my community. For most of the last 20 years, I spent traveling all over the country, flying around, training hospitals, and training other healthcare organizations in compliance and in ethics, and then running a small consulting practice out of Tallahassee. I also worked for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services as a senior executive in charge of kidney disease and transplantation for the entire United States. In that role, I actually had to build the culture we were talking about earlier, hire the staff, build the staff, be able to execute. I'm a big believer in both W.E. Deming, who some of you may know as a management guru who's been around since the 1950s. And one of the things that he says is about 94% of improvement in any organization is the system itself, what guides decision-making, the culture, the policies, the procedures, the enforcement. And only about 6% is due to individual decision-making. So don't blame the individual. The system gives you what it's built to give. And that is why this Independent Ethics Board is so important, because we are the people who kind of build the guidance, who build the system, that build the culture, that guide decision-making. I am guided by my faith and the Scout Oath in Law. I have been giving back to our community for a significant period of time as a Scoutmaster, committee chair of a local Cub Scout pack, a Scoutmaster for a local Boy Scout unit, and also serving as the Commissioner of Scouting for this local council for a period of years. And so for me, it's important that when we teach Scouts citizenship in the nation, citizenship in the community, and citizenship in the world, and we give them examples, and we have them come to meetings or watch meetings much like this, that we actually walk the walk. As leaders, we don't just show it to them, that we actively participate in our communities as well. I appreciate any consideration you give to my candidacy, and I look forward to the wonderful work this board is going to do. Thank you very much.
Okay, any questions of Mr. Augustine? Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, and appreciate your work with Scouts.
He also cooks great at the shelter. He volunteers at the shelter with me. My name's Bill Shack. How are y'all doing? I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I had some prepared notes, but I'm not really going to read it. But the only part I'm going to read is, I don't have a huge resume when it comes to developing ethics or things like that, but I am a common sense citizen, one who is so brave enough and so upset about the direction our city was going that he actually put his foot in the ring and ran for city commission, which I did in 2018. I did that because I was tired of seeing our city go in a place where it shouldn't go. And the impropriety that we kept seeing in the newspaper almost every week was something that I wanted to stop. And I figured, why not run for office? So I did. But I think it's more important that, and in this I'm going to read, I think it's important that how the residents who strongly voted in favor of an ethics board felt and have felt over the past few years. I just want to read a couple of quotes that some residents have mentioned. Initially, I was a huge proponent of the ethics initiative, but now that I see it in action, I realize it was wrong. I was wrong about it. Not surprised that the city leaders were trying to undo the citizens' mandate, but never thought they would be so bold. Our city government operates without fear of public outcry. 70% of the voters should not have to settle for a sharp poke in the eye. These are comments from citizens in Tallahassee. So at the end of the day, what I think y'all need to do is put someone on there who's like me, unconnected, not part of any organization that knows any of y'all. But my appointment would do two things. You know, I come from a background of the restaurant industry. When you're a manager of a restaurant, you're there closing up by yourself. You have to be a very ethical person, giving out drinks, things like that, keeping an eye on your staff. I mean, my industry alone, 30 years of being in that industry, has shown me what common sense and ethical behavior looks like. So I could certainly read a code and understand the difference between common sense and something that's a little bit more serious. But someone like me, the reason an appointment like me would be good, it would show to citizens who want to see city leaders and city staff help be accountable. They have to be accountable, and I think I would certainly be able to do that. It would also show true leadership on your part and send as a clear understanding that this ethics board is part of building the public trust in Tallahassee, which I think is number one priority that I think we all want to see. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Any questions for Mr. Shack? Thank you, sir. And Mr. Ray, I think you may be batting cleanup here.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carlos Ray, and thank you for your consideration. I want to start with two quotes that I think represent why I want to serve on this board. One is from President Barack Obama. He said, "The people cannot trust their government to do the job for which it exists, to protect them and to promote their common welfare. All else is lost." The other quote is from P.J. Rourke, a satirist, who said, "When you give money and power to government, it's like giving keys and whiskey to a teenager." I think the role of this board is to rekindle a trust in government. The tribalism and groupthink we see in our society and our community has resulted from people losing trust in institutions, from churches to government. People no longer believe that people in power are there to serve them. They believe that people in power are there to serve their self-interest. This board can play a role in rekindling that trust. I want to dedicate the public service I have done for 12 years to this board. For 5 years, I prosecuted Medicaid fraud here in the state of Florida and across the country. I worked with investigators and analysts to identify patterns of fraud in organizations. I didn't bring any case unless I had the evidence to bring a case to court. So I worked with my experts to make sure we had everything necessary to make a seal-tight case. For the last 7 years, I've served as Assistant General Counsel in the Florida Department of State. I have served as the ethics officer during that time. As the ethics officer for the Department of State, I've engaged in training of my employees. Training so effective that I have employees come to me when they receive a water bottle from individuals outside the department asking, "Is this acceptable?" I always say no, send it back. Here's a note to say thank you, but no thanks. That's what's necessary from an ethics board, from ethics policy. One where employees stop and think and ask, is this right? When careers are ruined because of tickets, something is wrong. Because they didn't ask the right questions, they didn't stop and think this may be a wrong policy to institute. So if I'm given the opportunity to serve on this board, I'll bring my service, my analytical skills, and along with the public service I've served in my professional life, my prior life has been dedicated to public service as well. 6 years on the Code Board for the City of Tallahassee, 2 years as chairman, 1 year as a code magistrate for the City of Tallahassee, and I currently serve on the Leon County Board of Adjustment Appeals. My life and work has been dedicated in reading and understanding the ordinances of the municipality, making sure that they're followed accordingly, and making sure that individuals are treated fairly and equitably when they come before my boards. I thank you for this time and this consideration. I hope that I've shared enough with you to understand that I want to serve on this board to continue to give back to this community and to rekindle the trust that people once had in institutions. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Ray? I note that Ms. Ray is here with you.
Yes,
Does she have any comments for us? Do you want to talk?
Want to talk, Bianca?
No?
No?
You want to give your dad a thumbs up?
Is it good? There we go.
Okay,
He's
okay.
got one vote there. All right. Thank you
sir.
so much.
Who?
Ms. Meadows-Keefe has a statement for us.
Okay, real quick, there's another applicant, Mr. Tom Napier. I hope I'm saying that correct. Napier. He did not receive the emails that all of you other folks received for some reason. He called to indicate that he'd found out about the meeting. I checked and made sure that I'd sent him the email, and he wanted me to make sure to convey to the board members that he's not sure why he didn't get the email, but if he had gotten the email, he would be here. So I promised him that I would pass that along, so I have done that.
Okay. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am, you're recognized. I assume that's it for board applicants. Okay, so I'll take any other comments now that anybody wants to make.
The only comment I would like to make, and yeah, Mr. Napier was also here at that meeting and talked with you guys. The only comment I'd like to make is a request that you query of the applicants if any of them are planning on running for office in the next couple of years, because I know that has put the board in a bind in the last, and I think that is a relevant question.
Okay. Well, given that, anybody here planning to run for office of any kind in the next couple of years? Okay, seeing none, I'll take that as a resounding no. Now, what I'd like to do is go through the members. I'm going to go I'm going to go in order of seniority and ask you if you would identify your top candidates, however many they may be, off the list. And if you like, you don't need to feel compelled. If you'd like to give reasons for why you chose those people, otherwise we'll just, we did not have a published list of criteria. We are going with who each board member thinks would fit the board well. That could be in terms of not being an attorney. It could be in terms of a diversity. It could be in terms of ethics background or professional background. We left it up to the individual board members to decide. So that said, Ms. McNeil, you're up.
Okay, I would like to say it was really hard to narrow the list down, but my top four are John Owen Clark, Patrick Kelly, Diane McCain, and Carlos Ray.
Okay. So I got Clark, Kelly, McCain, and Ray. Mr. Smith, you would be second.
Okay, I had it down to two. First, I numbered them. Number 17 was St. Charles, and I was looking at him from a diversity aspect, procurement and purchasing, and I thought that may be something that would be a skill set that would have been beneficial. And who I had, the only other one that I chose, again, everyone was so, I thought we had a lot of qualified candidates, but I went with number 19, Mr. Ray. Carlos Ray. I was really, again, I was looking at the diversity piece. I was looking at the experience, especially in ethics, as an ethics officer. So that stood out to me. And now just hearing from him personally, it really kind of went along with my thoughts from what I read on this application and this Vita.
Okay, so I got Ray and St. Charles.
Mm-hmm.
Next would be, who's next? Ms. Graham.
My four, and this is not in any order, it's alphabetical. Gretchen Brantley, John Clark, Patrick Kelly, and Carlos Ray.
Okay, so Brantley, Clark, Kelly, and Ray. Mr. Payne.
Okay, again, alphabetical. I have Brady Augustine, John Owen Clark, Patrick Kelly, Diane McCain.
Okay, I've got Augustine, Clark, Kelly, and, McCain. Sorry, I'm a little slow here. Ms. Graywell.
Doing great.
And just going down the list, Mr. Augustine, Mr. Barton, Miss McCain, Mr. Ray, and then Miss, is it pronounced Trammell? Is that correct?
Okay, so I got Augustine, Barton, McCain, Ray, and Trammell. And mine were, get myself in a column here, Miss McCain, Mr. Ray, and Mr. St. Charles. Please don't anyone take offense, anyone who's here. I have to tell you that my personal view is that any one of you, each of you, would make a great addition. And if you want, in about 18 months, I can pass you on to President Thrasher to replace me, because many of you would do a better job than I. Again, each of us, we asked each of the board members to just bring their views on what they thought would flesh out the board. So it may be that you would be the best choice, but you're not, in someone's mind, the best choice given the current 6 people we have as we try to fill in gaps in whatever we think are individually think are the weaknesses of this board. So what I have to summarize, I have 2 for Mr. Augustine, 1 for Mr. Barton, 1 for Ms. Brantley, 3 for Mr. Clark, 3 for Mr. Kelly, 4 for Ms. McCain, 5 for Mr. Ray, 2 for Mr. St. Charles, and 1 for Ms. Trammell. Let me go over that again. 2 for Mr. Kelly, 1 for Mr. Barton, 1 for Ms. Brantley, 3 for Mr. Clark, 3 for Mr. Kelly, 4 for Ms. McCain, 5 for Mr. Ray, 2 for Mr. St. Charles, and 1 for Ms. Trammell. So, if everybody's got that, any discussion?
Having never been through this process previously, it seems to me that we have one candidate who has received the most support. And again, I'm friends with many of you, so this is not easy. But I do think that in order to move forward, that Mr. Carlos Ray, who received 5 votes, would be who I would recommend we go forward with, Mr. Chair.
Is that in the form of a motion?
I so move.
Is there a second? I get a second from Mr. Smith. Is there any discussion on the motion? You recognize.
I did want to ask Mr. Ray, there was no mention of your candidacy for county commission last year. Was there a reason for or against not mentioning that?
Nervous, probably. But yes, I did run for office. And I did it because I thought an opportunity to serve in greater capacity. I'm not going to run for office in the next few years. It took a toll on my family, and I did it once. I know people run for office. It's an experience, but if I'm getting an opportunity to serve on this board, I think that's service enough right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed say nay. And we have a selection. I would give you, thank you to everyone who came, and thank you for your comments, and thank you for your interest. It would be my intention that we keep a list. As you know, we've had amazing turnover on this board recently. We may be back at you in sooner than any of us anticipate. Mr. Ray, you are, assuming, do we have an extra seat? Huh?
Mr.
Yes.
Ray, what's your daughter's name again? Bianca. Bianca, congratulations. Bianca, how old are you? You're 8 years old. Goodness. Yes.
Yeah.
You're having a lot of fun on your spring break.
Unlike us. Mr. Ray, I would give you the option. You can choose to start next month, or you can choose to start at 4:30 on March the 19th. If you want to come up here and participate today, you are more than welcome to. We can pull a chair up here for your daughter, or she can sit out there. We have at least, that is by my count, at least 4 responsible adults in the room. No offense to you, irresponsible.
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, so she has a responsible adult and a friend.
Bianca, if you want to come up here, though, you would add a lot to the board.
Mr. Ray, I would normally introduce you at your first meeting, which I probably don't need to do. If you would like to make any additional comments, you're recognized.
To serve on this board, and I think it's because I see the importance this board serves our community. You guys are doing a great job, and thank you for helping me, giving me the opportunity to help in any way I can to serve this board.
Let's do this.
Oh.
Yep.
No, it's fine.
We're getting him a mic.
Here it comes. Here comes the mic man.
Okay.
Thank you.
Look at this.
Well, nervous.
We got our act together.
Members.
We have,
Okay, that done, and I am reminded that this is the first time since this board's inception that we have had all 7 members seated, so yay us. That moves us to the Ethics Officer Report. As always, we will go, there are multiple items in it. We will go through each one and take the opportunity to ask questions, make comments, and receive any public input that is appropriate. The first item, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized on the summary report of your activities in the last month.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. I provided the usual array of services that I do every month. I have also attended different community events. The thing that I've added kind of in response to some comments at the beginning of the year is applied learning as applicable to ethics from the various meetings that I attend. So, for example, you'll see there was a community forum on the public safety complex. So everything I go to now, I'm trying to extract from that principles that can be applied to ethics here in the city of Tallahassee. You'll see those 2 pointed out there. And what I'll say I've noticed just in general at these gatherings is the public engagement is increasing in the community. Those public safety forums, the last one conflicted with this meeting, but the one that I attended was very well populated. So the community does seem to be engaged. I am continuing to provide introductory ethics orientations, monthly live ethics educations as needed. There's also need for targeted ethics education, and right now the focus is on the folks that serve in the summer programs. So, for example, the folks that work in the summer camps, the lifeguards at the city pool. The city has made sure that all of those individuals receive ethics education prior to starting. So some of that requires Sunday at 5 o'clock at Truesdale Gym with 100 high school students and college students who don't want to put their phones away. And that's all good. I tried to make it interesting and relevant to them. Let's see, we did have a lot of work this last month with revisions to the ethics code, which will be the focus of this meeting, and various calls and questions.
Okay, excuse me, any questions, Ms. Meadows-Keefe? Seeing none, the next issue is the tracking report. And I want to remind the members of something. The way that the charter amendment was drawn, it created this board. It also created a fraud and waste hotline, which is not the board's responsibility. It is Ms. Meadows-Keefe's responsibility as our ethics officer. So you will see in the 5th column on this report, she lists all of the calls she gets to the hotline, regardless of whether or not they are ethics calls. It is within her discretion to close calls or to close issues that are not ethics related. The board took a position some time ago to have her review for us all of the calls she gets so that the board would have the opportunity to see if any board member thought anything was ethics related, even though she did not initially think so. So on these two, they are not ethics, at least they don't appear to me to be ethics violations of the current city code. And she has recommend closure. That would be for really us. She's recommending that we agree with her closure of these issues. We need to distinguish a little bit between the ethics issues that are our jurisdiction and the mismanagement issues that are within her jurisdiction to refer on to the appropriate authority. So, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you want to walk us through these two, 159 and 160, please?
Yes, I'm starting with 159. And I will also say for the newer board members, the Ethics and Fraud Hotline existed at the city prior to me coming. It was actually, I think, instituted under Sam McCall in the auditor's office. So I took that as part of my job responsibility when I started and have continued. And now that falls under the board's or under my responsibilities. So it existed before, and now it belongs to the ethics officer and the board. So the first call was someone that called to report a county employee that was allegedly performing private business on work time. So the action taken was that I verified the person. First of all, I couldn't figure out they worked for the city. They did actually work for the school board. I reported it to the school board attorney, and they're going to take it from there. So therefore, that's not in our jurisdiction, and I've closed that with the board's agreement in the form of a question.
Just go on to the next one.
Okay. The next one is simply an individual was having trouble pulling up the city's calendar of meetings. Occasionally there is issues with that, but I checked on several operating systems, and when all else failed, I asked the gentleman, did you reboot? So he didn't make me wait on the phone while he rebooted. I'm hopeful that he was able to access the calendar, but again, I didn't see that as an ethics violation, so that's reflected as closed.
Okay, any comments or questions for Ms. Meadows-Keefe? Any concerns about her having closed this? Okay. Next item on our agenda is our monthly budget report. You will see this every month indicating what our expenses are, what they were for the prior month, and how that fits into our available budget for the year. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, anything, or Ms. McNeil, anything on here that jumps out as unusual?
The only one I wanted to talk about was the budget. If you want the next page, once we get there, we'll talk
Okay.
about that.
You might want to flip your mic down because I don't know that's going to pick you up at that angle.
No.
Okay, any questions on that page? The next page is something you will not see every month. This is, as we move into the next budget year, so you might see this once a year. Ms. McNeil, you're recognized.
So I just wanted to let everyone know there's 2 additional items on the budget for this coming year. and it's the second description, the salary enhancement we're putting in there for, give the board discretion to give a raise over and above what the city actually does. And then the other one is an accounting expense down at the bottom. We are going to include an audit expense in there, so I just wanted to let everyone aware.
Okay, and that's in line with our discussion over the prior couple months about getting an audit done sometime toward the end of this year, which would be our 5th year of operation. We thought we probably ought to have ourselves audited just to make sure that we are catching everything we need to catch.
But everything else was pretty much in line with previous years.
And as we've pointed out in the past, the city supports us in 3 ways. One is they created the ordinance that has the penalties that we can issue. They set our budget and fund our budget. And the third is that they create the ordinance, the ethics ordinance that actually sets the types of behaviors that are prohibited. And certainly on the first 2, we think they've done a great job, and this continues their support of us budgetarily, which, as Mr. Smith can testify, is not always the case for all ethics boards, having come from a board where they had 0 budget, as I recall. The next 2 items kind of go together. The first one is a list of all of the public records requests that have come into the city, and the second one is a subset of that list of the ones that the city flagged as the most significant, most important, whatever. I don't know exactly what their criteria are. I don't think they have written criteria. We started looking at this over a year ago just to give the board members an opportunity to see if there were public records requests coming in that looked like they might lead to some discussion the board needed to have about an ethics issue. If, for instance, we started seeing public records requests for tickets received from the universities for football games, that would, I think at these days, it would flag us to do our own independent investigation. So if anybody on these lists ever has anything that they want to see followed up, clearly we could get a copy of the response to the public records request, or we could take whatever other actions board members might want to take.
Mr. Chair, if you could just refresh my memory, who is responsible when these public records requests come in? Who's actually fulfilling them?
Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Board Member Graham, the public records requests come into the city treasurer clerk's office. They are the official records custodian for the city. And some of these are routine public records requests, any power cutoffs for a certain address. Some, and I'm not sure what the criteria are, trigger communication with city leadership, and they're informed of those. So that's why there's 2 separate lists. And some of this stuff is actually confidential pursuant to statute,
right,
and that's why it's blacked out.
So who ultimately will be is responsible for fulfilling the public records request?
The treasurer clerk
The
circles
treasurer
back.
clerk takes it in, and do they have a software that they run this through for trigger words and that kind of thing?
Well, if it's an email search, they do have that capacity. And I'm actually not savvy enough to know, but then I also know that if it's pertaining to, say, for example, me, any and all things you may have, I also have a responsibility for producing anything that I may have that may not be in the system. So, but ultimately the treasurer clerk gets them and sends them out after trying to make sure it's complete.
Ms. Meadows-Keefe, let's in the next couple months ask if somebody from the city would come and describe their process for responding to public records requests, just so we will be well-informed. Ms. Green.
The reason I ask is I was responsible with the Leon County School District for fulfilling public records requests, as I was the ethics officer as well. And you can take a broad interpretation or you can take a narrow interpretation. Our new member is nodding his head. So I'm just curious at when these come in, who is making that decision? Whether they're taking a broad interpretation or a narrow interpretation before fulfilling the request.
And I think based on a prior court case in the city's policy, the city's taking a broad interpretation of public records requests. So if there's a question, they're erring on the side of inclusion rather than on the side of leaving it out.
Okay. Thank you.
But we'll get city folks in here, and you can ask them directly, so we're not relying on secondhand information. I would point out that item 2019-110 on this list has complaints filed with Human Resources or the Ethics Board. Recognizing that that request did not come to this independent board, the records custodian, would the records custodian have access to all of our records, or ought we on our own initiative to respond to this? Or, Mr. Board Counsel, ought we to simply wait to see if that request was made of us as a records custodian?
I can answer first,
Ms.
if you don't
Meadows.
mind, because I actually did this. Since this was, I think, our first issue that we dealt with as a board, I knew that there were probably documents in my office that were not in, we're calling it on base now, is the system where everything's supposed to be uploaded. So in abundance of caution, I went through my office, I located the files that I had pertaining to this matter, and I sent them to be uploaded to OnBase so that they'd be produced. Anything that's recent now should be searchable through the OnBase system and email.
Okay, can you come back to us with, I am concerned that there may be public records, since I don't think the city would necessarily have every record that we would have as an independent board. I am concerned that someone might make a request of the city thinking they are getting our materials when in fact the city may not be the records custodian of some of our materials. Can you come back to us on that issue and how that would work in the future, and if we need to change anything?
Absolutely. The recommendation in the meantime, with the board's permission, would be that if the board members have anything in their possession that they believe pertains to board business, there's this email address the city set up. It's retain@talgov.com. So if you have things at home on your personal email, you can forward them to that address. That automatically puts them to where they're searchable. The same with documents. I also have a scanner. I can scan for you if you don't have them. So that's kind of the reminder I give periodically. But I will come back with a more formal answer.
So something that we each need to be careful of, and I know I have forwarded a number of emails there, and it doesn't take but a couple seconds to do, so it's just a matter of remembering to do it.
Mr. Chair, excuse me, might I suggest that Ms. Meadows-Keefe be proactive and notify us of any such requests so that we can search our own records?
Sure. And again, anything that if somebody in the audience sends you an email about the business of the board,
right,
even though she doesn't know about it, you need to, that's a public record, and it is to your benefit to forward it on to the retained site, because then when a public records request comes in, you don't have to go back through all your public records.
Right.
You know that you've kept them.
I'm glad to hear about this email address. I hadn't heard about that before.
Yes, that was good advice. Thank
Or
you.
they can send them to me, whichever.
And you can see this month, the last document was there was only one that the city had flagged, and I suspect because it's nearly a decade of information on Star Metro, I don't think there's any ethics issue there. You can see the kinds of things that the city might flag as the most significant of the public records requests. That moves us to our ethics moment. We instituted that for the new members. We instituted ethics moment a couple of years ago. The board members were not inclined to sit down annually for a full board meeting where we got ethics training. So what we decided to do is that every month we would do 5 or 10 minutes on some topic of interest in ethics world, and it would give us an opportunity to keep up, to address the issue of the day, and also to make sure that we are getting in our ethics training in addition to whatever other issues we deal with during the meeting. So, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized.
Mr. Chair, I think we agreed that the ethics moment this month was going to be an overview of this meeting and kind of the background to it. So we'll be going over this, I think, in more detail later on in the meeting, but The ethics moment this month deals with our report and recommendations to the City Commission and why the board does that. We're required in the charter amendment to produce a report each year, and we're also tasked with making recommendations to the City Commission for passage of different ethics ordinances. So the first part of the letter is simply a report, and for new board members, I know all of you have probably looked at it already, but it provides a summary document of the board's activities in 2018, its accomplishments and what it's done, and things that it may need. So again, we talk about a 7-member board, which is the first time ever we've had the 7 folks. The authority that we received from the commission last year for misuse of position and tightened gift restrictions and other elements. The other element that I want to bring up is, again, for some new members and maybe some folks in the audience, how the ongoing development of recommendations that are before the board today for discussion arrived at this point. The board began discussing recommendations presented in this report and recommendation in April 2018. I think it became the chair's fond reference to call it the blue sky list. But recommendations were taken comprehensively. It was not just from board members. It was from members of the community. It was from city staff. It was also being out during campaign events and hearing what people were saying about ethics. Different types of suggestions all made it onto the list. It was reviewed each month, and the narrowing process began in October 2018. And so last year, the board did make recommendations to the City Commission actually in March of 2017, and we did not include any draft language. So we sent a report to the Commission on March the 2nd, 2017, with what our recommendations were pertaining to misuse, gifts, and some other elements. The board did not receive an immediate response, so the board followed up in 2017 with some draft language, okay? So the reason the board today or next month will present draft recommendations in the form of ordinances is to hopefully abbreviate the passage of time between the time the board makes a recommendation and it gets before the commission and can get voted on. So we have taken a comprehensive look at that and distilled it down. So that's kind of the ethics moment for this month, if I haven't forgotten anything that the chair wants to chime in.
The only thing I would add is the charter amendment. So the city charter requires us to make recommendations as we see fit to the City Commission regarding the ethics ordinance. The charter also requires the City Commission to consider, not to adopt, but to consider our recommendations. So just to put that in perspective. What I want to do is, for a moment, is delay the break and start on item 8. I can tell you that I know a number of people in the audience would like us to do the selection of the board council prior to doing the draft report and recommendations, because our acting, I guess, board attorney has a speaking part, and there is a feeling that that may give him a better view in some people's minds when we get to the discussion of the board council. So what I'm going to do at the moment is admonish everyone here that, again, that when we get to the selection of the board council, we are starting over with 8 applications and a de novo consideration of all 8, and that anything that Mr. Reed has done for us in the last couple of months, any work prior work that we have seen from any of the other applicants, including one who served as our board attorney for a number of years, does not count. We are going to start fresh with our discussion of who the board attorney ought to be when we get to item 9, and I have a number of cards on that. Is there anybody who needs to speak now on that issue? Okay. What I would like to do, Ms. Meadows-Keefe has already gone. Do you need to go over your draft report again?
I do not, unless folks on the board want to make edits.
I have one thing. I think when we went through the blue sky list, we decided there were a number of items that we wanted to recommend as amendments to the city or ethics ordinance. There were a number of items on the blue sky list that we said we thought could be recommended as policy changes. And I think that we need to add those policy changes, and I can list them very quickly. One was a pretty strict recommendation that the mayor and city commissioners should vote on each issue with some technical ways to get around if you can't be in the room. The second was that any compensation for an elected official or their staff should be prospective only and not retroactive. There was an issue some years ago when there was a retroactive award of a retirement benefit that caused some stir. A third one was to adopt a nepotism policy. There already is a pretty clear state law to prohibit nepotism, but we thought the city could go farther in terms of requiring disclosure of any member of your immediate family who works for the city, just that somebody ought to keep that list, even if it's not nepotism, even if it's two people who don't work in the same unit, don't have any hiring or firing or promoting authority over each other. The city ought simply to be aware of that and ought to be publicly available. So we know if there are three brothers working in different parts of the city. The fourth item is outsourcing, that there be some requirements, some additional requirements when the city outsources any service or activity that's currently implemented by city employees and is of any significant nature. We had talked about a $50,000 limit, anything where the city spends more than $50,000 to outsource something that's currently being done internally, that ought to be carefully reviewed, and that the entities to whom the service or activity is outsourced ought to be subject to the city's ethics ordinance so that we don't lose jurisdiction. The fifth is to make ethical public service an organizational value of the city. Next would be to include a provision in contracts that says that if it is determined after the contract is signed that the contract was awarded and was influenced or attempted to be influenced by a prohibited gift, that contract could be voidable by the city. Next is to make a public database of city contractors and vendors and a database of employee salaries so that is publicly accessible. Next to last would be to ask human resources to consider an ethics-based question or an ethics-based component to in-person job interviews. And the last would be a commitment to ethics presented as a job requirement for any leadership team by the appointing official. Those were things that fell out of our blue sky list where the prior members of the board or prior version of this board did not feel that we necessarily needed those as an ordinance that would give us direct jurisdiction, but they were all things that if the city put those policies in place, they would support the ordinances, the ethics ordinances that we are asking for. So Ms. Meadows-Keefe can have that in the next version. Everybody can look at it. And actually, if you would email that list to everybody and make sure that if there's anything there that anybody thinks needs to be moved to an ordinance level, in the past, of course, we have a different board, but in the past, people thought those would be okay by policy. So, okay, I think I'm done talking. Mr. Sims, you're recognized, sir.
Could I ask a quick question, Mr. Chair? I'm sorry. Mr. Sims, if you just hold on for a second, Mr. Sims. You know I love you. What is the level of holding, if a policy is violated in the city of Tallahassee, what is the process for holding someone accountable for having violated that policy?
That would be up to the city. We have, in prior situations where we thought that something was amiss, for instance, there was a harassment case that did not violate anything ethical, and this board made a recommendation to the city that we thought they ought to have clear policies in place, and they developed those policies in response to something. The violation of city policies can be whatever the city management, in terms of the severity of the violation. I can tell you for a lot of the rank and file employees, it's that you're terminated. If it's any violation of any significance at all, unlike high-paid folks, like many of us at this table have been or are, you don't get a pass typically when you're rank and file, and we see that pretty regularly in the city.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mr. Sims.
I don't know if this was addressed or not, but over the past year and a half, we've also talked about having an independent investigator, and I noticed that Ms. McNeil had added 2 other categories to the budget, and I was just wondering if another category for an independent investigator, i.e., for situations, and I hate to bring this up, such as football and tickets, it just gives a greater sense of transparency when we were able to say that we have an independent, and so we don't have a fund for that. And another little caveat that I keep driving home, and I feel like the lone voice in the thing, I am a little uncomfortable with the relationship with the ethics office and city employees. I've worked with the state. I've worked with other municipalities. You know, there's a line when you're in the Inspector General's office. The Inspector General don't come and have lunch with you. You know what I mean? Or buy you a Coke. And so these are the kind of things that I think that need to be.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. And I would point out to particularly the new members, we've had the discussion over a couple of years about how we would do an investigation. When we attempted a couple of years ago, we had a board member who was a retired FBI agent and was, let's just say, plugged into the investigatory community in Florida. We approached a number of potential investigators, and they were of a uniform mind that if we had something we wanted to hire them for, they'd be happy to work for us. They were not anxious to commit themselves to us without being paid, even if we didn't have work for them. So rather than hire someone when we don't have work, what we have is a short list of names that we are ready to go on, and there are other people who in this community who can provide that kind of service. And we've sort of, decided to hire investigators as needed. We think we know some that we can go to very quickly. I think Ms. Meadows-Keefe, didn't we have like 3 or 4 people who said, assuming I don't have a conflict, yes, I'd be happy to work for you?
Absolutely. And we also have a budget category for other professional services. So that's how it would get funded. So even though you don't see investigator there, that's how it would get paid for. So the money's there if it's needed.
Our other option is to put somebody on a $3,000 a month retainer, whether we need them or not, and that gave several people heartburn. The materials prepared by Mr. Reed fall into 3 categories. The first, is a draft ordinance that would be part of our recommendation to the city, to the mayor and city commission about ordinance changes that we are asking them to make this year. The second is, since we were asked to look at all of Part 3 of Chapter 112, anything else that might be in the current state ethics laws or indeed in local ethics ordinances in other jurisdictions, anything that we might have added, items that were not on our blue sky list, but that could at some future point be. So I would say that second document is really kind of the beginning of our 2020 blue sky list. The third document, since we asked Mr. Reed to think broadly about an ethics ordinance, he identified a number of areas where we are short on policy related to our process and procedure. After some discussion, that third document was broken out as things that we do not need to ask the City Commission to do by ordinance. They are things that this board can and should control through its own policy and bylaws. So what we're going to focus on today is the first of those three documents, and you all can look forward to the fact that once we get through with these recommendations, on the next agenda will be the beginning of a review of our bylaws, particularly as they relate to our process and procedures in cases of formal ethics investigations, complaints, prosecutions. So, Mr. Reed, if you would like to go over, excuse me, your document, what I'm going to ask to have happen here is Mr. Reed's going to go over he's going to summarize what he's done, and we're not going to do questions or debate at this point. Excuse me, after that we'll take a break, then we will come back and we will go item by item through the recommended ordinances that we are going to send to the City Commission, and we will take comments, questions, edits, additions, deletions, anything else that board members have. We'll have a full and fair discussion on an item-by-item basis, but I wanted people to get to see the overall map that has been laid out here, and then we'll take our 15-minute break, which will give you time, hopefully, to digest the map, and then we'll come back and regurgitate the map. So, Mr. Reed, you're recognized.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you, members. Let me go ahead and review. As the chairman stated, there are three sections. I'll put the bulk of our time into Section 1, which really simply codifies what this board has established as its blue skies list into the form of ordinance, something that we could then take to the City Commission and ask to be adopted. But first and foremost, I went section by section. Felt strongly that a definition section, previously we had definitions sprinkled throughout the ordinance and throughout the code. We felt it was important to put definitions in one unified section and put that up front like we do at the state level. So 2.3 was a defined loyalty oath. We kept the loyalty oath present in there since that is somewhat of a definition. But we simply added additional definitions which really follow generally what you would find in Chapter 112 of Florida statutes. There are a couple of issues that I think are worth pointing out. The word corruptly, I know that's an issue that's been debated by this board for quite some time about whether that creates a heightened burden that we don't feel should be necessary at the local level. Ms. Tamayo, my better half in this endeavor, met with the chief ethics advocate for the Attorney General's office a couple weeks ago and asked her position on the word corruptly, and she had a different opinion. She felt that the word corruptly was not necessarily a higher burden, and she has been involved in a lot of cases where she's been able to prove corruptly by clear and convincing evidence before an administrative law judge. We did, what we ended up doing is we kept the term corruptly as defined by statute. We didn't feel it was appropriate for us to redefine a term that's already defined in state statute. However, we created a subsection or a subparagraph of that subsection which clarifies the definition, and it simply adopts the interpretation by the first DCA in the Blackburn v. State case, which is the citation is 589 Southern 2nd 431. Now, the definition itself, like I said, it's exactly from Chapter 112. Corruptly means done with wrongful intent and for the purpose of obtaining or compensating, and then the rest of the language continues just as we see at the state level. The state statute does not define wrongful intent. We create a paragraph underneath that takes the language directly out of the first DCA's opinion to define wrongful intent, to clear up any ambiguity. Generally, the ALJs over at DOA, I think, are using this standard. I think there may be some competing briefs before the first DCA, and we're still waiting for those opinions to come out. However, based on Blackburn and based on most of the DOA recommended orders that I was able to find over the past month, they have stuck pretty close to the wrongful intent definition of Blackburn. So I would recommend that we keep corruptly, but include the clarifying language of wrongful intent. I think where we were concerned, I think before, I think last year it was considered by this board about including some additional language, willful, something to that effect. And I think there was some concern that you created an intentional standard that may be too high and actually higher than corruptly would be. And we actually may be shooting ourselves in the foot and be doing going in the exact wrong direction. So the recommendation that I think is before you today is to keep the statute definition of corruptly, which I think we're required to do, but then clarifying it with what the first DCA has established. We also defined jurisdiction. Now, if you look at the charter, and I know this is something we discussed at our last meeting, was how far does this board want to go? Currently, we don't have a lot of teeth in our code. We have some policies, but don't really have a whole lot of way to enforce it, and that's a big purpose of the document here is to change that. The charter does say that this board has jurisdiction over officers and employees of the city of Tallahassee. So we've tried to play with that to stay consistent with the charter, but not to go too far. And ultimately, that's a policy decision that needs to be made by this board. But I wanted to put at least as many options forward as possible so you could make that best decision. A term that was developed, and I think, Mr. Chairman, I think it was you that actually came up with the covered individuals definition, because we had kicked around a public official. We have the magic 9 individuals that we commonly refer to, the 5 city commission, the 4 appointed. Who else do we want to cover? Because currently right now we only really cover 9 people. We had discussed covering also those that are required to file a financial disclosure form, whether it be a Form 1 or a Form 6. And then we also felt it was important to cover procurement employees, those that might be open to corruption, to include that into that definition. So we do have this definition of covered employee. Each ordinance is going to be a little different. If it's intended to only cover the covered individuals, it will say covered individuals. If it's meant to go beyond that, it will go beyond that. For instance, misuse of position covers everybody. And that's obviously a policy decision that's a broad net, but we did want to put that forward. And if you want to contract and bring it in, you can. But those are essentially the big definitions. The other one that was essentially a creation of mine, and I didn't take this from anywhere, so I do want to let you know that a lot of this was taken from the state statute. Jacksonville has an outstanding ordinance. Palm Beach County has an outstanding ordinance. And most of the other municipalities don't have very much. So I think based on all the research I've done, Tallahassee, I think, is above and beyond where most local governments have done. And I think that if we really adopt a lot of the changes that we've been talking about through the blue skies, I think we would probably be able to put ourselves in the top 3 with Jacksonville and Palm Beach County. But the issue of remedial order was to depart from the final order for those that we felt that maybe we should have some advisory jurisdiction over, but not delve into issues that are more appropriate for the Human Resources Department. And I think that dealt with when we have a violation that would apply to all employees, which some do. What disciplinary action should be taken by this board, and what should be taken through the city and through the HR department? And do we want to just simply punt, or do we want to have a role? And I think the position that we did in our process over the last 4 weeks, and this is for consideration of this board, is we would create what would be a non-binding recommendation that would be sent to the HR department to be included in their file. And the HR department could decide to adopt our recommendations, or they could decide to do something completely different. But it would allow us to at least weigh into certain matters that we feel are important and fall within the certain violations in our code, but wouldn't get our jurisdictions so far where we're now stepping on the toes of the HR department, who might be more appropriate to handle those issues. We amended Section 2-4. This really is just a mission statement for the board. previously we had 2-3 and 2-4. We simply just said that, we added what the statement of purpose was. That was something that we did not have in the code before. Jacksonville, Palm Beach County, and the state code include a purpose. So I felt that adopting that language just so somebody could see, you get your definitions in the first section, you get your mission statement and your statement of purpose in the second section, would be a good way just to start our code. We then move to section 2-5. This is the ethics officer duties. And I think one of the issues from what I understand, and if the chairman or the ethics officer correct me if I'm incorrect in my history, but I understand that the ordinance was probably adopted before this board really had the opportunity to have the rubber hit the road and see how things were going to work and work out the kinks. And a lot of the duties here are really not appropriate duties. And I think it would be better for this board to exercise as much control over the ethics officer to then decide what truly should our ethics officer do. Currently, we do have a defined responsibilities and duties within our bylaws, and that is probably the appropriate place to put them. So that allows this board to maintain more control. So if there's something we want to maybe expand duties in the past or retract duties, we don't have to keep going back to the city commission for changes. And that's primarily the purpose there. Next, we go to 2-6, and this is the misuse of public position. Now, I do want to point out that as I was going through this before the meeting, there's the word no elected or appointed official, which is the terminology that was used throughout the code prior to us drafting any language. What I tried to do throughout here is I used the term public official, and then I defined that in 2-3. Public official is a term that's defined, I believe, in section 112.313, and I was using that definition as a model. So what I would ask is if at the end of the evening tonight, we will not be voting, but I guess we'll be making recommendations and coming back at a later date. I would like the opportunity, if I continue in the position, to clean that up and put public official and make it consistent throughout the code. But right now, there's a little conflicting areas, but essentially that's to me in the same position. Elected or appointed officials are essentially the 9 individuals on the wall. And then whether we want to extend it to aides, chief of staff, legislative directors, et cetera, is a policy decision by the board. But on misuse of public position, that is an area where we extended it very broad and covered all employees of the city. So currently it's only the 9 pictures on the wall. Now it would be anybody from the mayor to the janitor. I know that's very broad, and obviously that's a policy decision to make, but we thought that this is where the remedial order could come into play, where if you find that, somebody, I think we used an example, if somebody's working for Public Works and coaching a team and is helping parents get their kids on a different soccer team or something like that, is that something we want to be able to look into? And I think that we felt that maybe it is, and while that's more of an HR issue, we want to at least give people the opportunity where they could file a sworn complaint, it could come to us, we could do the investigative process and then refer to the appropriate governmental entity that might be able to take the most appropriate action. We also removed the $25 limit, so now it's any value whatsoever that person realizes or any special privilege or benefit. We took out the 25. The definitions were simply removed from 2-6 and moved to 2-3, and they were not changed in their context. Next, we go to 2-10, and this was the disclosure of offers of employment to elected officials. And one other point is that the way our ordinance is written is that we have a certain number of sections. So I think when I originally sat down, I started creating sections, and then I realized we're going to run out of room. So I said, okay, well, now I've got to start consolidating and find out ways to maximize the ordinance the best way that I could. So when it came to the disclosure of offers of influence, which was one of the items on our Blue Skies list, it felt appropriate that those were 2 issues that were somewhat similar, and we could probably consolidate them into one section so we don't use up all of our sections in case we want to come back in a year, 2 years, or 3 years. So essentially, this is simply codifying the disclosure of offers of influence from the Blue Skies list. And then previously, there were no A or B paragraphs here because it was only one section, so we broke it into an A and a B. So now it's two separate subsections within Section 2-10. 2-13 is the solicitation of gifts. I know this is a big issue. We expanded that beyond the Magic 9, and we included the covered individuals. So that, again, would be those Magic 9, the 5 City Commission, 4 appointed, the financial disclosure employees, those that file, I guess, would be a Form 1 at the city level, or I know at the state we file a Form 6. And then the procurement employees, which I think would be important to get covered under the gift ban. We add the directly and indirectly language to make sure we don't, create any ambiguity in that language. And then we essentially eliminated paragraph 2, and we combined it into one paragraph. Paragraph A initially was there was a ban on soliciting a gift of any value, and then Section B was to accept a gift in excess of $100. So since this board had previously said we want to have a zero limit whatsoever, we were able to consolidate those two paragraphs and say instead of solicit in paragraph A and accept in paragraph 2, we just put accept and solicit in the same paragraph, and we accomplish the same goal. Gift, we went ahead and just simply referred to the statute. The statute has an extensive definition for gift, as well as exemptions to what constitutes a gift, like an honorarium, those types of issues. We simply refer out to the state statute, and we did put in the catch-in language that you put in ordinances as it may be amended from time to time, so that way we're not stuck with a snapshot of what the statute looks like today, but when the legislature decides at a later date to go back, we would simply follow the state statute unless we, at a later date, decide we didn't want to do that, and we could then come back and tighten that language. 2-14 essentially says that the sworn complaint, we removed some language that really wasn't necessary. Essentially, we said if it's for violations of the city ethics code, so to list specific, to include, or not to be limited to items. I think just by saying ethics code, we cover everything that we want to have jurisdiction over. As far as penalties, we do have the oral reprimand, the written reprimand, the remedial order or written letter of instruction, which is that new item that I had discussed where we essentially, a non-binding recommendation that we provide to the city. And a lot of that was if we have a collective bargaining unit contract, we don't want to interfere with that in any way. So we wanted to be real careful that we didn't go too far with something that was more relevant for an employer-employee relationship, but we still wanted to have a role in it. Corrective action.
How many contracts does the city operate under? Collective bargaining contracts?
I don't know
okay.
at this time. Corrective action, we did include restitution. I think that was something we didn't have before. If somebody receives a benefit, we'd like to get that back, and I think that was something that we've seen at other codes. And then we've kept the penalties largely unchanged. In Section 2, we do add some additional items, and we'll get to that, I think, after the break. One of the items that was on the blue skies was a new Section 2-15, which is the disclosure of use of non-public information. Kind of called it your insider trading clause. If somebody gains information because there's an employee that's not available to the general public, they can't utilize that for their own gain or benefit. And that was, like I said, an item on our blue skies list, which we codified into a new Section 2-15. 2-16 is a new section. This is, I have another government client. I've actually been knee-deep in this exact same issue. There's a subsection 3 and a subsection 7 of 112.313. There's a doing business with an agency, which is subsection 3, and a conflicting employment or contractual relationship with subsection 7. We decided to take the subsection 7 from the statute and try to tweak it a little bit so we could cover the doing business with, but really just keep it as one. The conflicting employment and contractual relationships was the item on the blue skies. However, I did try to incorporate some of the intent that falls under the doing business subsection of the state code so we could cover as much individual behavior as we thought was necessary. We also included information about, well, you have the basic disclosure if they're involved, like Florida Bar. If you're a member of the Florida Bar, you pay dues, you're a member, but if you're the city attorney, you need to be a member of the Florida Bar. So there's that exception for those types of issues. We did say that a covered individual, and again, that definition, the three people that fall within that definition, they would be prohibited from soliciting any employment. They would be required to disclose to the city attorney and to this board any offers of employment or contractual relationships that's prohibited by this section. And I think that's one of the concerns that I think was made at maybe the last meeting is if something bad is happening, say something, do something. This creates a duty on the covered individual to actually report it if somebody's trying to solicit them to doing something wrong. And then the opposite is true. If the solicitation is done by the covered individual, then the person that does business with the city of Tallahassee would have a duty to report it to the city attorney's office and to the ethics board. And then we did provide a provision if by chance the soliciting employee happened to be the city attorney, obviously you wouldn't report to the city attorney, but it would just come directly to the ethics board. Okay, and then we renumbered, as you could see, we have sections, we had 2-15 through 2-20 that were reserved within the code. We now have 17 through 20 that are reserved, so we have 4 additional sections that we could use at a later date. We then moved to Division 4 within the ordinance, which is entitled Ethics Board. The board complaint processing. Didn't touch it a whole great deal because I do feel that's probably more appropriate for the procedures, which is part 3 of the proposals before you today. But we did add at least subpoena and authority to take testimony under oath to the board. So you will be able to subpoena persons, documents, and things. And then you would also be able to take testimony under oath. And that was an important point. And then the last one is one that is really more of a cleanup, and it takes us outside of Division 3 and Division 4 of the ordinance into the lobbyist regulation. Currently, I think, and this may be more appropriate for Ms. Meadows-Keefe to discuss, but I guess currently the lobbying registration goes to the Treasurer's Clerk office, but the ordinance gives the authority to oversee it to the ethics officer. We simply return it back to the Treasurer Clerk since they are the office that provides that service. We also increased penalties for lobbyists that are found to have violated the lobbyist regulations. Currently, the penalty is maxed at $500. We increased it to $1,000 for the first violation, $2,500 for a second violation within the 3-year period, and $5,000 for a third violation within a 3-year period. And that's essentially the blue skies codified version. Mr. Chairman, would you like to open for questions now or go to the next section?
Let's do this. Let's go ahead and take a 17-minute break. That'll bring us back at 5:45. If you have questions that don't need a full discussion, feel free to ask the board attorney during the break. Individually, obviously, we can't meet, can't have a group discussion. We'll come back and we're going to go through each of the dozen or so items one at a time, make sure that we answer any questions or attempt to address any concerns that anyone has. If it goes too far, if it didn't go far enough, I suspect the advocates may have some comments on specific points, and we will take any testimony they have. With that, let's take a break until 5:45. is 5:46. We are a minute late, and we are back on the clock. Couple people we are still waiting for. Okay, let's go ahead and start looking at the ordinance. I want to walk through these things one at a time. We have a new, start on page 2, is the definition section that's rolled in with the section that's now the loyalty oath, so it has both components. This picks up, as was described, a number of the definitions that I think fit with the various sections that we're recommending. Most of them are pretty common sense, defines the ethics board to mean us, defines what a vendor is. The two new things are, to me, actually 3 new things. On page 3, the definition of wrongful intent as it relates to corruptly, which makes that a slightly stricter standard. Again, on page 3, the definition of covered individual, because our recommendations either go to all employees of the city or to those employees of the city who are procurement employees or Form 1 filers, which would be more your management types, not your I don't know, not the broad base of all employees. And then on page 5, this concept of remedial order. And the idea there is that we would have the opportunity to give non-binding recommendations in situations where we don't want to give a binding recommendation because it might impact some contractual obligation that the city may have, or where, let's say, a rank-and-file city employee does something that's a clear violation, but we just don't think that, we think they got kind of caught inadvertently. It wasn't a pattern of behavior. And so rather than issue a penalty under the remedies section, we just wanted to basically write a letter saying, you just need to be more aware and stop doing this. It's kind of a very low-level penalty for people who don't deserve to be, really punished. But does anybody have any questions on the definitions section, pages 2 through 5? Anything that causes concern? Do you guys want to talk to the corruptly issue? All right.
My name is Peter Butzine. I represent Common Cause and the Citizens for Ethics Reform. I wish to primarily address the standard of proof for adjudicating ethics violations. This is the part that begins with lines 80 and then 245. As some of you know, our coalition has consistently supported knowingly and intentionally, rather than corruptly, or even wrongful intent as the appropriate standard of enforcement. Last year, this board, or a predecessor of this board, agreed with our position. However, when the issue came before the City Commission, Scott Maddox was adamant on aligning the language of the Tallahassee Ethics Ordinance with the Florida Ethics Commission that requires corrupt intent as the standard for enforcement of misuse of public position. We responded that our interest was not to unjustly catch public officials in malfeasance, but instead the charter amendment that we put on the ballot in 2014 was and is intended to go beyond Chapter 112, which we regard as a relatively weak law that the legislature reluctantly passed to implement the 1976 Sunshine Amendment and has mostly refused to strengthen ever since. Now, Mr. Maddox is an attorney, and he came to the conclusion that we should align it with that Chapter 112. And while he stated at the time that he was just trying to align the city's ordinance with Chapter 112, we were not fooled by his argument that acting corruptly is much weaker standard than acting knowingly and intentionally. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. But I fear that respondent attorneys could use the corruptly standard to obfuscate effective enforcement, and that's our primary concern. For instance, could this board have been able to find that former city manager Rick Fernandez violated the provision against misuse of public position if the standard required proof of corrupt intent? We knew that he was knowingly and intentionally violating the law because the Ethics Commission subpoenaed his emails. However, proving corrupt intent is much more difficult. And this provides only one relatively recent example of the importance of a couple of words. Finally, the politics of this issue suggests that the Commission is prepared to support the knowing and intentional burden of proof. And that's because we've met with all the current commissioners. The burden of proof issue has been our coalition's top priority. All the commissioners well understand this important concern because we've brought it to them, particularly in light of the ethics challenges that have unfortunately plagued the city of Tallahassee over the last couple of years. We believe that the current commissioners stand ready to embrace the more reasonable and I would say common sense burden of proof. And while there are many changes in this proposal that we support, we continue to have some questions. For instance, should outside employment simply be reported to the city attorney? Wouldn't it be better to have outside employment reported to and enforced by the ethics board? Or if not just by the ethics board, maybe the city attorney and the ethics board? The recommendations require that the board only consider sworn complaints. We have consistently maintained that the board should not only consider but encourage anonymous complaints. Enforcement of lobby registration, disclosure, and enforcement, I would argue, should be accomplished by the ethics board's enforcement. And it's the ethics board's responsibility and not the clerk. There may be other potential problems. At least, I would suggest that you engage an expert opinion in drafting the final recommendations that go to the City Commission, and we will continue to make our case that that expert is Phil Claypool, who served as the head of the Florida Commission on Ethics and well knows not only its strengths but also its weaknesses. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Bitzine? Okay. I made a list here. Dr. Jackson? Please.
Two quick questions, or two comments. Penalties, it's so hard. I've spent the last 8 or 9 years, most of you know, trying to expose corruption in Tallahassee. It's a thankless job. It's expensive, but it's important. No one else wanted to volunteer to do it. The other day, we had our final hearing regarding Fernandez. I guess he wasn't fired because we had to pay him. The city paid him to leave. The ethics, the final decision regarding my ethics complaint is that he had taken about $6,000 in gifts, tickets and birthday and wedding and whatever, and they came up with a fine of $6,000. Now, $6,000 is nothing, okay? The problem, I just heard here, we went from a penalty of $500 to $1,000, okay? It's not worth, you know how much money we're, I'm not going to say wasting right now, but this process is expensive. We can't say, oh yeah, Fernandez make $250,000 a year, give or take, and boy, we're going to fine him. He just stole $6,000, and we're going to give him a penalty of $6,000. What does that say to the other employees here? If you're high enough in the food chain, nothing's going to happen to you. Okay, that's one thing. We need the document you're reading, I haven't got. I know it's on the internet. I can download it, et cetera, et cetera. But what we need, and I say we, I've been at this for a long time. These folks, advocates, continue to show up. We would like to have a meeting with hopefully the newly appointed legal counsel so that we cannot just sit here and give you 3 minutes worth of comments. We want to have a workshop. We deserve to be heard. You need to have the input from folks other than yourselves. I don't think that's to have a workshop. If anyone else here would like to attend, if we can do that without being, doing anything unethical, I think that's something very important to do. So please allow us to do that. The commission, one other thing, I've talked with all the commissioners. Word this, put some real teeth in here, okay? Let's start out at $5,000, $10,000 for the first offense, okay? $25,000 for the second, and then let's remove them from office, okay? Or let's fire them. Whatever the categories are, $150, $500. It's embarrassing. Like I said, I spent more than $6,000. Hell, I spent $25,000 minimum just on Fernandez on this one case. And then he's fined $6,000? Well, hell, I lost more money than he did. The last thing, I've talked with all the commissioners. Put teeth in this thing. They will agree to anything you want. They've told me individually that if you folks, whatever, they have a lot of faith in you, a lot of trust in you, you're the experts, whatever you come up with, they are not going to balk. No one wants to be seen like Scott Maddox did defending his turf, a year or so ago. Whatever you want, now is the time to put real teeth in there. And where we're headed, we're frustrated out here, and I appreciate it.
Questions for Dr. Jackson? You're recognized.
I'll be brief. I think the idea that Dr. Jackson had of the workshop is a really good idea. I think that it'll allow for the free flow of ideas back and forth, and it will make a better process in the end.
Thank you. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Ben Poitevant. I live at 2341 Limerick Drive. I've been working with this board off and on since its inception. And I have seen the board struggle in its organization, trying to find its place. And I've seen the board slowly but surely become recognized. But I regret to say that what I heard today, some of these recommendations both encourage me and sadden me, because there are some strong recommendations in there that give this board a significant more influence in city government ethical issues. Strike now while the iron is hot. We need to change some of the recommendations that you just heard and never yield to any outside authority, such as the city attorney. This board should not be turning over any ethical decision-making to any person in the city government. Inform the city government, allow them to have their input, whether it's HR, the city attorney, whoever it is, but never turn over the authority of this board making ethical decisions to any member of the city. I would like to echo the request for a workshop. I think these folks have certainly earned their place at the table, and I would ask that you consider having a workshop to address their issues, my concerns, others who have concerns that the recommendations fall way too short of what many of us hoped would be the opportunity for this board to shine. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Questions? Seeing none. The next change in the draft is on page 6, simply stating that this is...
Mr. Chairman, are we moving to a new section?
Yes, I was off, I was off of definitions.
Okay, there was just
I'm sorry, go ahead.
issue I wanted to add to the definitions, and it was the issue of the term corruptly. And, we spoke to the Attorney General's office. They have a disagreement with your opinion. They feel that the willful, intentionally language that's being recommended today creates a mens rea requirement that's going to make it very hard for this board to prove corruptly, which is why the clarifying language, which is meant to soften it and adopt the first DCA language, would, according to the chief prosecutor with the Attorney General's office, she says this is actually going to be easier to prove than what was just recommended. There is another option, and this is something I pulled before the meeting. Palm Beach County has something that actually takes it all out together and creates a known or should have known standard, which is somewhat what the willful intent case law language utilizes, but if it would make anyone feel more comfortable, that is an option for the board.
Okay, would the members feel comfortable on this issue? The idea is that at our next meeting, we'd have pretty much a final draft, but on that piece, we would have an alternative set of language. So we'd have an A or a B, and we would pick one, and that we could still vote on the final product, so we can get our recommendations done quickly. So we can pursue an alternative to the corruptly and see what that looks like, both legally and then how the members of the board feel about it. Okay. The next change in this draft is on page 6 that basically just says this is supplemental to state and federal codes. I don't think that's anything of any great import. In terms of our jurisdiction, the same on page 7. This code was originally adopted before the board was created, and the city had created the ethics officer position, and so by ordinance they put in the ethics officer duties. We think that those could come out because the duties are defined either by the charter or by this board, not by city ordinance. And to the extent that there was a conflict between what's in the ordinance and what this board said, I would hope that Ms. Meadows-Keefe would do what we asked and not what the ordinance said. So
Absolutely.
That's just an opportunity to get rid of some unnecessary language. Page 8, we come back to the use of the word corruptly, but here, misuse, we remove the option of having something valued at less than $25. So any dollar value could be misuse. And the big thing here is we expand it from 9 people, 5 elected and 4 appointed officials, to include those 9 people along with any employee of the city. And I suspect we will, there may be some pushback. We've heard stuff about collective bargaining, for instance, but that is not within our bailiwick, and our job is to make recommendations. And I think prior discussions in this board have been pretty clear that this was something the board thought that anybody who works here could do something corrupt and ought to be subject to the same standards. So, any problems, corrections, comments? Seeing none. The definitions are struck on page 8 because they're moved to the definitions section. Next big change is top of page 9, where we add required reporting of offers that are meant to influence. This would apply, as has been described, only to covered employees, so the rank and file employee who in grounds maintenance, for instance, wouldn't be covered. This would be your elected and appointed officials, your folks who are required to file financial disclosure, and procurement employees who, as defined by law. So people who have decision-making authority or some authority over the expenditure of funds or the awarding of contracts. You recognize?
Mr. Chair, I think one of the points that was made by an advocate was that this requires it only to be reported to the city attorney, and maybe it should be city attorney and the ethics board. And that is, I think that is a very valid point. In the conflicting employment contractual relationship section, we do actually provide both bodies as required reporting entities. And for that concern that was raised, that would be a very easy fix to this.
Okay. I'm seeing board members nod their heads. In the final draft, then, unless there's objection, we would expand that to include reporting to this board. Okay, without objection. Any other comments on this required disclosure? On the bottom of page 9, we have solicitation or acceptance of gifts from vendors and lobbyists. Again, this expands it from the 9 people to the covered employees, which is the folks who file financial disclosure, and procurement employees. So rather than just the elected and appointed officials, this would capture a larger group of people who, again, are involved in making management decisions and awarding contracts. Any questions on that? Any concerns with it? Seeing none, we'll move on.
I just had a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Somewhere else.
Talking to the mic, please.
Oh, sorry. Somewhere else, wasn't the knowingly, directly, and indirectly stricken or adjusted somewhere else as well?
I don't recall, Mr. Reed, is that? Because here we have directly or indirectly accepting. That's the directly or indirectly on page 290, I think, comes from the same language on 298 and 299. Since these, after our changes in A, we really captured all of B in them and expanded. So I think that's where those words came from, was just from a lower line. On page 10, Mr. Smith pointed out at our last meeting that corrective action was not defined, or it wasn't very explicit. So in an attempt to at least move somewhat in that direction, we included this new penalty of restitution. So in addition to, if somebody does something that has a financial benefit to them, in addition to paying whatever fine might be issued, they would also have, could be required to, without any dollar limit, to provide restitution for any pecuniary benefit.
Mr. Chair, I'm wondering if this addition of restitution would alleviate Dr. Jackson's concern about inadequacy of fines.
Speaking for Dr. Jackson, I think his concern probably would be in line 339, paren 6, the fine itself not to exceed $1,000. And then the other place is on line 353, the board can order payment of investigative, can basically require the violator to pay investigative costs not to exceed $1,000. So if we spend $5,000 on an investigator, we could recapture $1,000 of that expenditure of public funds. I think if you wanted to address Dr. Jackson's concerns, you'd probably be in those two lines.
Well, again, like I said, I didn't have that with me tonight, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking. It needs to be a real penalty. I think if you've been found 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, something. But on the second or on the third offense, they need to be fired, and their retirement needs to be taken. Okay, if this commission, not this in the city commission, would have fired Rick Fernandez, all right, and took his retirement, that would send a message that even the guy on top can't steal from the public. What we've been told was not that. What we've learned is if you're on the top, then you can escape. And that's what the problem is. So I'm not sure what line you're looking at, but yeah, put in some serious penalties and then attach their retirement. A person shouldn't accumulate retirement here for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and then if you do something that's unethical, 3 times ought to be, he ought to be out of here on the first time, sometimes maybe, but we need to have serious retirement. Removing their retirement, that's a penalty.
Okay. Ms. Payne?
Is that an option at this point of putting in termination as a penalty?
I do not know how the city commission would react to that. Let's do this. Let's come back at the next meeting. We'll have some language that could be added.
Just one thing, they're going to support anything you come up with, and that's a great idea.
Well, Dr. Jackson says it's not a problem. We'll have some language that could be added in. Let me suggest as a middle ground what we might do on lines, again, for consideration when you see some actual language on lines 339 and 353, to have a fine up to the actual pecuniary value of the violation and to allow the board to recoup actual costs. That would not put an upper limit so that if somebody stole $25,000, we could issue a fine up to $25,000. You want to come to the microphone, Dr. Jackson? Because I want to hear you say that you're robbing a bank.
Okay, yeah. Let's just say if I rob a bank and I get caught, and then I get arrested and I go to jail, and you say, "Oh, Dr. Jackson, you stole $25,000." You're going to have to give that $25,000 back. That's your penalty. Boy, that's going to make me stop and think twice. No, that's. We need to have a real penalty. At least start out at 4 times what you stole. So if you stole something for $1,000, then it's $5,000. If you stole, and I'm still dealing with FDLE regarding Rick Fernandez, and no one in here has done anything. The real money he stole is when he used city labor, city materials, and remodeled his daughter's rental house. And no one has mentioned anything about that. All right, I'm still working on that. But we have to have real penalties. So yes, saying we'll give back what we've stolen, that's what just happened with Fernandez. He had stolen, took gifts, took stuff that's not his. You come up with the adjective. And then they said, we'll go ahead and we're going to give, you did wrong. Give us back what you've stolen. And that's your penalty? I think that's ludicrous. Thank you, though.
Questions?
It's not a question, it's a statement. There is a legal standard by which someone is determined to have so egregiously violated the law that they lose their state retirement. There is a legal standard for that. And so I would say that we should look at that standard as something that we use in our ordinances, in our ethics code.
I think the standard generally relates to commission of a felony. So,
and that may be the case. I'm racking my brain. This is an area I worked in a while ago, but I know that is something that we should, I think, take a look at.
Okay. So again, without objection, we will come back next time. So what we'll have next time is a draft ordinance that's ready to go, and then we will have a subset of, would you like to substitute these lines on page 4? Would you like to substitute these lines on page 6? And we will do yes, no on those things so that we can vote on a final product. You will know exactly what you're voting on, but we'll make some small decisions on some of these points, and that can be the second round, is on the penalties here. Okay, good. That would move us to page 11, which is disclosure of insider information. So taking something that you learn on the job that's not public information, and then using it to the benefit, financial benefit of yourself or others. So you learn about some property or some area where the city's liable to do some work and nobody else knows about it yet, and you get a family member to go buy properties there knowing that you're going to be able to.
AKA insider trading?
Yes, ma'am. AKA, also known as. This, again, would apply to all employees, not just management employees, because even rank and file employees could well come into possession of this type of knowledge. So we drafted this one very broadly, unless anyone has any concerns about that. Okay? Seeing none. On page 12, and Mr. Reed, you're going to jump in here if there's anything I'm short sheeting, right? On page 12, is this conflicting or employment or contractual relationship? So this basically says you shouldn't have employment or a contract with an entity that's doing business with the city such that the employment or your contractual obligations conflict with your public duties. This would apply not to all employees, but to covered individuals. So again, the Form 1 filers, elected and appointed city officials, and the procurement employees. So rank and file people, to the extent that they did this, they might not necessarily be captured, but those are probably going to be relatively minor violations. We thought here that where this occurs, that it would be of concern in ethics world would be with the higher level employees who actually are decision makers in the city. So comments, questions?
I do have a question. Is the ethics officer or anyone informed ahead of time of the Form 1 filings or any reported conflicts?
Not today, no. There's no process of required notice to the board on these things. These would be probably, based on what we see at the state level, these would probably be things where people like folks in the audience file a complaint or note that something untoward is occurring. And then it gets investigated by somebody like this board. Anything else? No? Okay. I would encourage you to read this carefully. If you have any wordsmithing, get it back to Ms. Meadows-Keefe, and she can put it in the pipeline. This is the longest section. Again, it's drawn from a couple of provisions in Chapter 112. The next big change is on page 13. This is the board's subpoena power. This was something new for this board. We had it on the blue sky list. There was some discussion about taking it off. Then there was a general consensus that the board members of the board at that time pretty uniformly thought that we really ought to have this. Mr. Reed, any comments about how the subpoena process would work in practice? Anything we need to know?
At this point, I think we would probably need to go back and see whether we want to go through the circuit court for enforcement purposes, which is an option. I know once the issue would be referred to DOA, we then fall under the jurisdiction of DOA, and the administrative law judge could actually issue subpoenas upon request. And then I think we discussed the last meeting, we would then be subject to your rules of civil procedure, which do govern discovery, and we would be able to seek documents through the discovery process from a party, and then they'd be subject to sanctions if they failed to produce.
Okay, so this is going to occur only in those situations where we've got a legitimate and probably difficult complaint, probably where we've hired an investigator. This will be in a case where we're spending some money to do the investigation. And we have checked there. It is pretty clear that a city can give this kind of authority to the board. I think there are a couple of adjudicatory boards already in the city of Tallahassee that have very similar subpoena power. So the question had been raised, could we even get this power? And I think the legal answer pretty clearly is yes. Then on page 14, and I think we heard a comment, we may hear more, that One of the recommendations related to lobbyists, and we kind of split the recommendation that was on the blue sky list. There was part of it that the board did not want to pursue, and advocates came and said, you know, the penalties for failure to register as someone who is lobbying the city are far too weak. So we went into the section that provides those penalties, and it's not a part of the ethics ordinance. So here we're reaching outside the ethics ordinance. And we increased the fines a good fair bit. So instead of the $100 fine that's cross-referenced here, the fine would be $1,000 for the first violation, $2,500 for the second, and $5,000 for the third violation. And this is the fine solely as it relates to someone who is for hire, being paid by an entity to come and lobby the city for the benefit of that entity, not somebody who on their own comes and says, you know, please don't do something in my neighborhood, or please do something in my neighborhood. As an individual, obviously, you're not a lobbyist is captured here. So this is a 10 to 50-fold increase in the fines. But when we looked at this, and this is something that you guys need to think about, currently it says the city ethics officer has to monitor for lobbyists. So basically people who come and try to influence the city. So that's if somebody comes and meets with the city attorney or meets with the city treasurer clerk and is representing someone else. Well, we don't have a seat at that table. We're not in those meetings. It can be, and often is, as any good lobbyist would know, you get your real work done in somebody's office, not appearing in a public meeting. So when we talked about how this could be enforced meaningfully, we were concerned that we would never find out about these things unless someone complained to us, that the city would be in a better position to monitor who comes into the offices of the city officials, whether they're elected or appointed, and determine whether or not those people are registered to lobby when they come in, obviously being paid by some entity to work on that entity's behalf. So that was why we were suggesting here moving it to the treasurer clerk. It also is the case that we have not in this proposal asked for, and this is something that was on our blue sky list and we kind of backed off of it a little bit, the ability to reach out to people who are not city employees and find ethics violations against them. So somebody who's lobbying the city obviously is going to be a private person, not an employee of the city. And if we want to reach them with the ethics code, we're going to have to do some additional drafting to be able to get to them, just like we would have to do additional drafting to get to providers of city services who are not city employees, contract providers, or vendors for the city. And I think the prior board's feeling was that we needed more time to think through how all of that would work. Now, we can get there, and if you guys want to see language, we can do it. But it particularly when you get to vendors, if this, for instance, if the city's buying office supplies from someone and that entity creates does something that's unethical, to give us the authority to reach out to the local office supply vendor is an interesting drafting issue, let me say. So I would welcome any comments concerning the language on page 14, and I recognize Mr. Wilcox on this point while everyone cogitates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. I'm Ben Wilcox with Citizens for Ethics Reform. I'm concerned about this moving the oversight of the lobby registration to the treasurer clerk's office. And my concern is not so much the penalties for failing to register, but how you're going to enforce the lobby registration requirement. And, a couple of ideas. I mean, I think the ordinance or the charter amendment gives you oversight over lobbying, and I think you ought to at least leave open the option for someone to file a complaint with you that someone is lobbying and has not registered. And I also think another consideration would be to require public officials, this is an idea that's been done in other local governments, to keep a log of their contacts, their visitors at the office, and even it could go as far as to include phone calls. So that would be one way to identify lobbying activity that's taking place.
Okay. Members on this? Please, you're recognized.
Perhaps I'm singing to the choir, but lobbyists are the primary source of many of the ethical issues that arise with government employees. And to take that registration and oversight away from this board, to me, is not very wise. It is an integral part of what this board does, and I would hope that you would not move that oversight to any other entity of city government.
Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Quickly, I want to talk about how this lobbyist registration currently works and what the role is. I think when the job was originally constructed before the board's origins, there was some oversight over lobbyists in that job description. In that capacity, I receive a list of registered lobbyists from the treasurer clerk's office, who is the records custodian and the records keeper for the city. I receive those registrations quarterly to see who's registered and who hasn't registered. So there is that capacity right now, and that's actually a readily identifiable place for people to register because they keep all the records. I have had calls from individuals that have asked me, they call and ask me, do I need to register as a lobbyist? I ask them what their intention is. Are they being paid? Are they just a citizen? And actually, I have directed several people to go ahead and register as a lobbyist. So in abundance of caution, if there's payment involved and it's not a private citizen with a concern, they're advised to go ahead and register. Under the charter amendment, we are enabled to recommend ordinances that pertain to lobbying. I think we've interpreted it in the past that it's not a direct reporting or direct registration. We are independent of the city for many purposes. So people associate the registration process with the treasurer clerk. The treasurer clerk does loop me in. I do get the calls. I do direct the people to register. And then I have gotten complaints pertaining to lobbyists that have been reported to this board. So that's not to counter anything anyone said. It's simply to let everyone know how it's currently working. And I have not observed issues with that.
Mr. Payne.
Yes, just a clarification, I guess. If the treasurer clerk is currently the records custodian, are they doing any monitoring at this point? Or are we asking just to codify what is actually happening already?
They have a policy and procedure, and I believe in ordinance, in city ordinance. It's not under the ethics code, but that lobbyists do register, and they are required to register. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess my concern is, are we asking for additional workload on the treasurer clerk's office that
they already do it?
Okay, that was what I was concerned about.
If you look on line 449 of the draft, we're in Article 8 on lobbyist registrations. That article contains, I don't remember, 5 or 6 different sections. that relate to the duties of the city treasurer clerk and the requirements placed on people who lobby the city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that, the only place that we're mentioned in that entire article is here in section 2-345. So what if we did this? If we give you at the next meeting some alternative language that would do these things. It would say that the treasurer clerk and the ethics officer monitor, so you get both. So it gets reported in both places, which is consistent really with what we're doing now. That the ethics board may receive complaints concerning people who are not lobbying, may investigate those complaints, and may report violations to the city treasurer clerk. It would still be the city treasurer clerk who would issue the fines under this section as they currently do today.
And, Mr. Chair, the board could also suggest they get their public records requests for review each month. If the board wanted to see a list of who is registered to lobby the city, that could be provided as part of the ethics officer report for the month. If that was something the board wanted to see, I could very easily include that in the monthly report.
I'm seeing general nods. There's, yes. Okay, yes. 1 second. Are there any concerns with having that as alternative language at the next meeting? Okay, you're recognized. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I worked on the ethics panel, and that was my area, the lobbying regulations. And one of my recommendations was that after you failed to register, you got fined that third time, that you not be allowed to lobby anymore in this city. Now that, unfortunately, I guess was too strict because they didn't adopt that. But I think that there should be a list of registered lobbyists that goes out to the city commissioners so they know who's actually registered. And if someone comes in and isn't on that list, he or she should not be allowed to speak to him.
Okay. That would probably fit in terms of our recommendations and a policy recommend.
I think I was getting it.
Why don't you come to the microphone? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but just so we have a record.
Amy Toman, I'm the Deputy City Attorney. I believe that the lobbyist list to which Ms. Meadows-Keefe is referring is available on the public-facing TalGov site.
What we might add in our letter in terms of policy recommendations that we would like to see the City Commission adopt some recommendation about the awareness of the elected and appointed officials and maybe management employees concerning registered lobbyists and the requirement to register. That could certainly be included as part of their training periodically, just so that they're aware that when somebody comes in and talks to them and that person is pushing an issue that is to someone else's financial benefit, that their hackles ought to go up.
That's great. They do a thing each year called Critical Policy Review, where they push out policies that are to be emphasized. So this could be one of those that they emphasize if we recommend that.
Does that meet with people's approval? Ms. Graham?
No, I'm just thinking if you're a representative of the city, someone comes in to talk with you about an issue, what is your responsibility to make sure that that individual has in fact registered to lobby? What is the current responsibility? Is there one?
In the ordinance, there is not a requirement placed on the city official or employee. The requirement is on the lobbyist to know what they're doing and to lobby. I think it's the same with the...
So there's not, based on what we have been through, any expectation that, there's an expectation on the part of the elected official that that individual has in fact taken the steps to register already. Is there anything that would prevent that elected official from saying, have you taken the steps to register?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
I can tell you, you would know in a different forum, but I know certainly across the street in the legislature, that is not an uncommon problem. Do you represent so-and-so?
Right. Well, I would speak to my past experience when individuals would come through my office in Washington, D.C., they would identify themselves. in advance as who they were there for, and on what side of the issue they were there to talk to me about.
Right, and that might be a policy part of the policy recommendation is that they ought to, they could have a policy that suggest or that requires that type of disclosure when somebody is a lobbyist, and then when somebody doesn't announce that at the beginning of the meeting, that ought to raise concerns for the public official.
Person who was sitting on the other side of the table.
Yes, the person being not lobbied by the not lobbyist. Okay, so we'll have some additional stuff for you there. So we're going to have some alternative language on corruptly, outside employment being reported to the ethics board, additionally to the ethics board. We can take a look at sworn complaints and see how we would draft that as an alternative. I am less confident than Dr. Jackson about rubber stamping of our recommendations, but and we'll look at this lobbyist enforcement. We will look at enhanced penalties. So we'll have those five, in addition to our set of recommendations, we'll have those 5 things for us to consider next time and vote on separately, and we'll have sections, and they either go in or don't go in, the final set of recommendations. In terms of a public workshop, certainly you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, it's just one more that I like. We had extensive decision about when it came to abuse of power for elected and appointed officials. It said that it had to be a bar of they were gaining $25. And so I think that we should really revisit that issue of abuse of power, because there's a clip in there that says that they have to gain at least $25 in order to be found guilty.
Yeah, we had a provision that had the $25 limit. We've taken the $25 out.
You've taken that out?
Right. Now,
God bless you.
We did look broadly in the blue sky list, as I recall it, a brand new violation for abuse of power, and that did not make the cut because it was perceived as something that was going to be very difficult to draft. The last thing is on the public workshop. I know the commission will have one. What I would like to do, unless the board members object, is to schedule something within the next couple weeks. And it can be Ms. Meadows-Keefe and me and our attorney. And if we do a public notice, then anybody else can come if they want. And if not, then don't. And we'll sit down around a table somewhere here and we'll talk. And if there are things, if the board would give me the discretion, or whatever board members want to come, if there are things where we can, in addition to what we've already talked about tonight, things that we need to change, we could come up with some alternative language for the next board meeting. Although I think we've got at least, we are already drafting some alternative on everything that's been raised tonight. So I would hope we would not have a lot of new issues. And I don't want to, if we're going to try to vote something out at the next meeting, I think we may be pretty close to the limit of what we can do in terms of adding new materials.
Mr. Chair, I'm fine with that, but I also feel very strongly that it's time that we move forward and get language to the City Commission. And so if we are going to have a workshop, which is fine, let's make a commitment that we come back from that workshop, the next meeting, all of the board prepared to vote on language that will go to the City Commission. That's my only request.
Everyone's nodding up and down. I can hear the marbles rattling, at least in my own head. I think we are even our newest member, who didn't maybe know what he was walking into tonight. The reason we're under the gun here is that because we've got so many new city commissioners, and ethics was a hot issue during the election, we fear that as they get into their role of governing, ethics may slip as the the issue at the top of the list, and we want to make sure that we get our recommendations before them while their promises to the public are still fresh in their minds. If we wait a year, we may have slipped in terms of policy importance to the elected officials. Not that they don't think ethics is important, but just other things will rise to the top of the list.
Mr. Chair?
Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
At the City Commission workshop that was held, the commission did have it, and Mr. Payne was there. The commission did specifically request that the board expedite its production of recommendations, and they're anxiously awaiting those. So that's just something I'm bringing back, and I know I said that before, but it's just a reminder that they did talk about it as something that is top of mind to them, and it's important to do that while it's still in their heads.
I think it's important for the city of Tallahassee as well.
You're recognized.
Haste makes something, I forget what it was, but I think it's more important that we have the workshop and try to meet with the city schedule. That was not what I wanted to speak to, Mr. Chairman, if I may. One other issue that we have bandied about on a few occasions, and that is, to me, that puts teeth in the whole procedure that gives teeth to the board. And that is a requirement in the city structure that a supervisor becoming aware of a possible or potential ethical violation is required to report it up the chain. And at some point, it must be reported to this board for a determination of whether or not it is an ethical violation. So a requirement for a city supervisor to report a potential or possible ethical violation up the chain of supervision.
Okay. I'll take a look with Ms. Meadows-Keefe. We've got some.
There was something in there.
We've got some mandatory disclosure, but I don't think it goes anywhere near that far. Okay. One last thing I want to do. There have been numerous people, including a prior board attorney, who've said we ought to adopt all of Part 3 of Chapter 112, which is the state ethics law. As we ought to recommend that as our jurisdiction. We sat down and went through what's there, and we think that with this proposal that's before us today, we capture the vast majority of Part 3 of Chapter 112. There are significant hunks of that part of the state law that just aren't relevant for an ordinance. For instance, the creation of the Florida Commission on Ethics, whistleblower protections, requirements for lobbyist registration, which are already in city ordinance. We have, where possible, where we've picked up provisions that are similar to what's in the state statute. We have tried in our recommended ordinance to make them stricter than what's in the state statute, so that we are really enhancing the behavior and providing a more ethical environment. There are a couple of issues that relate to ethics that we didn't pick up. For instance, dual public employment. It says elected officials can't have two public jobs. You can't be a state legislator and a county commissioner at the same time. Post-employment restrictions and lobbying by formal local officers. We all know that those were on the ballot last November for a constitutional amendment that is going to substantially increase the requirements there about you can't be a legislator and quit and then go pick up lobby clients and lobby before the legislature. And employees holding office, which again goes to elected officials. But with the exception of those, we think that we've captured the other relevant provision, or the other provisions of Part 3 of Chapter 112 that relate to ethics violations. So without picking up the entire part, we think we're 95% there, and in many cases stricter, which is where we had really wanted to land. So for the people who've suggested that we just adopt Part 3 of 112 in toto, I just want to assure them that we have looked seriously at that issue. Questions, concerns, a lot of work for us to do in the interim.
I just had a quick thing.
You're recognized.
I know that we went through the lobbyist regulations. A comment was made about, on a third violation, about not allowing a lobbyist to retain any sort of lobbying power. Is there something that we could do about that in our capacity, either to recommend to the city commission?
We'll put that in the alternate language that on the third or subsequent violation that either I don't know whether a lifetime ban is reasonable, but a ban of some sort. It doesn't take much of a ban for somebody to lose all their clients, and from the lobbyists that I know, once your clients are lost, they're usually lost for good, even if it's only for a year or so. What I would like to do is push back the discussion of items 2 and 3 to a future meeting. If you guys think we have time to do board council, we can do that. We've got 13 minutes. If you think we can do it in 13 minutes, otherwise we will move it to next month. So what is the will of the body?
Is there some requirement, other than our time, that we be done by 7? Is that required of this board? Can we?
Ms. Graham moves that we extend our 7 o'clock deadline until the completion of.
Second.
And I apologize to my fellow board members, but. I would maybe go but for the will of the board if we want to push it. It's not.
I know Ms.
certainly not
McNeil has to leave at 7. Mr. Smith, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
And Mr. Payne? You guys? Okay. We will extend if it looks like I'm going to tell you if it looks like we're going to go much over, I would exercise the prerogative to cut it off, but we'll at least move forward some. We'll get where we can get. The other part was the most important part. So we are now on item 9 on the agenda, having skipped over much of item 8, but done the important parts. So, same process. Anybody want to speak to on item 9? I think we'll have a list, so you guys can arm wrestle for a slot.
I'm going to try and be fast. We've been your biggest cheerleaders, defending your growing pains and struggles. We've encouraged you, offering you advice and assistance along the way. And first of all, I'm glad to see all of you up there. 7, it's great. It's great to see you guys all seated finally. The special meeting in February in which you appointed Mr. Reed as board counsel had minimal attendance of the board members. There were 3 brand new members at the meeting, each of them having 1 meeting's worth of experience or less, with the exception of the infirm chair, Richard Herring, who was combating flu. The process entailed everyone submitting their top 3 candidates, interviewing the top 2, and then returning to the top 3 list to see who had the most votes before the discussion began. It was an extremely flawed process I hope to never see again. I would like to see a vigorous discussion of the candidate qualifications in the field of ethics. This board desperately needs board counsel who understands the ins and outs of ethics. They need his guidance, suggestions, and encouragement. Board counsel needs to be above reproach and have the full confidence of not only the board, but of the citizens of Tallahassee. With all due respect to Mr. Reed, it is not enough for you to say, we've had him as board counsel right now, even though he is temporary, and use that as a justification to appoint him permanently. We've done that before with disastrous results. Mr. Claypool is arguably the top authority on ethics in the state of Florida. He has extensive experience working with the Commission on Ethics for 35 years. Even after retiring, Mr. Claypool continues to work strictly in the field of ethics. Appointing Phil Claypool as board counsel will be a coup for the ethics board. No other conclusion is possible. Do not let financial means, the fact that he was underbid by Mr. Reed, be the determining factor. I understand the need for minimizing expenses, but this is the wrong way to do it. So let's not cut corners. And if I haven't made myself clear, I strongly encourage you to appoint Phil Claypool as board counsel.
Ms. Baer, can I make a comment?
Yes.
First, I really appreciate all that you and the advocates do, and I want you to know that.
Yes, we do.
I have an extensive background in ethics. I have an extensive background in looking at legal qualifications. My relative newness on this board in no way influenced my decision as to who I was going to select or recommend for the board counsel. So I just want you to know that, because I've heard that mentioned a couple times. So I'd just like to clarify that.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ben Portivant, and if you bear with me just a moment, I'd like to tell you just a little bit of a story about myself. After the Army and FSU, I became an FDLE special agent assigned for almost 7 years to Governor Askew. That's ancient history. It was during those years that I watched a man of great personal integrity, and I learned from him. It was from Reuben Askew that I developed my own personal moral code. Under Governor Reuben Askew, the initiatives, the politics of this state changed, and the Florida Ethics Commission was born. A few years later, I attended law school and served 7 years as an assistant state attorney. After too many years as a trial lawyer, I became an assistant attorney general, both under Jim Smith and Bob Butterworth. It was in that position that I was appointed by the Attorney General to be the prosecutor for the Florida Commission on Ethics. The prosecutor, actually called by the more politically neutral title of advocate, was assigned to review evidence of violations of Florida ethics law by officials statewide, to make a recommendation to the Commission regarding probable cause, and to prosecute those cases in which probable cause was found. It was in that position that I first met Phil Claypool. Then he was the Commission senior attorney. I learned very quickly that Phil was a virtual reservoir of knowledge in ethics law. I relied heavily on his expertise in evaluating and prosecuting cases. After I left the Ethics Commission position and returned to my regular Attorney General duties, I always maintained an interest in the Commission activities. I watched from afar as Phil grew in professional stature and crafted most of the state ethics laws now in place. In fact, the laws to which you are all subject by serving on this board have Phil's legislative and judicial prints all over them. Phil and I are friends, but I haven't seen him or spoken to him until tonight. I was surprised to see him here, and a little bit embarrassed, because I didn't particularly want him to hear what I said. But Phil and I are friends, and although he didn't know I was going to be here, I felt a duty to make certain that each of you know that Phil is, by far, the most qualified person for the position of senior counsel of this body. I urge you to select the man who is Mr. Florida Ethics, and in doing so, send a message to the citizens of Tallahassee that you have cast aside personal loyalties and political connections to aggressively engage unethical behavior in city government at every level. Show the citizens of Tallahassee that you have selected a council who has no agenda other than ethics in government. Phil Claypool has spent a lifetime doing that. Thank you.
Questions? Just to get right, we have a motion and a second to extend the meeting past 7 o'clock. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Okay, so we passed that. Anybody else wish to? You're recognized.
Thank you. Marilyn Wills, Citizens for Ethics Reform. Scandals in Broward and Palm Beach counties were probably the trigger for creating an ethics panel, advisory panel in Tallahassee in 2012. Those of us who served on the panel hoped to ensure that Tallahassee would not have the same problems. We met regularly for 6 months. One of the most helpful persons to address the panel was Mr. Phil Claypool. Mr. Claypool had been associated with the Florida Commission on Ethics from the time he left law school until his recent retirement. His advice was invaluable. We followed his recommendations to ask for an independent ethics board and an independent ethics officer who would not answer to the mayor or the city commission. Mr. Claypool's advice to us was invaluable, and I can't think of any other person who would be better able to make a contribution to the ethics board. Thank you.
Questions? Seeing none. Next.
Irwin Jackson, 1341 Jackson
Dr.
Bluff.
Jackson, let me interrupt you for 1 second. We're about to lose Ms. McNeil, and I would like to get her, if you have comments that you'd like to make concerning the selection.
I just want to recommend John Reed. I just think he's done great for the board so far, and I just think he's fully engaged, and I've been really impressed with his work so far.
Okay. Okay, and good luck with, I guess, childcare duties.
Yes, spring break, sorry.
Yes, spring break.
Mr. Chair, question as to procedure. Do we need to make a motion to include her support in the ultimate vote, or how will that work?
I'm not sure that we can take a vote of somebody who's not here.
Okay, but we've all heard
Yes,
the support of Mr. Reed, so, okay. I didn't.
You shouldn't be able to vote to hear all the input, shouldn't you? I'm not an
It's just my
attorney.
recommendation.
Yeah.
Okay, but given that she had to go, I just wanted to make sure we gave her a chance to speak. You're recognized, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you very much. I just first have a question, Mr. Chairman. I read somewhere, someone told me that Mr. Reed had done some other work as an attorney looking into, I think, maybe Fernandez's case for this board, or Fernandez, or maybe it's Andrew Gillum. Is that correct?
Yes, we had a...
You had hired him to do something.
We had a complaint involving an elected official that met the first, that got past the first round of our review, so we were in a non-public meeting, and at that stage, we hire, like the attorney, like the Ethics Commission does, we hire an outside attorney, because our attorney acts as rep attorney for the board, and we hire an outside attorney
And
as
then my
effectively the
question,
prosecutor.
though, very good. That was my understanding. Then my question was that selection made by the board, or was that selection made by the ethics commissioner or the ethics officer?
That selection was made by me.
By you?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much.
Because we were on a very short leash. We had just
Thank you very
a couple day turnaround, yes.
Very good. Phil Claypool, to me, is the best person for this job because, first of all, he's the most knowledgeable, he's the most experienced, he's the most independent, and the least political person that I know of, and that's what you need from your legal counsel. And also, I would point out that it's very important that Phil Claypool has not been compromised by Julie Meadow Keefe. Let me explain. I said long ago that Julie should not be selected as the ethics officer for several reasons. Number one, she was originally handpicked by a corrupt city commission and city attorney. She had no experience in law enforcement or prosecutory experience. And I think she failed the city of Tallahassee more recently by not taking more appropriate actions to expose the activities of Fernandez, self-serving activities of Fernandez, Maddox, and Gillum. In addition, her decision more recently to establish a personal relationship with an appointed city official was just wrong. It may be unethical too. I think it is. You can't have someone who's an ethics officer who's responsible for the oversight of individuals creating a personal relationship with those she's supposed to be watching. We can't accept that from any city employee, but especially the ethics officer. You talk with city employees, they know what's going on, they think it's a joke. Does anyone else not know in this room? We learned today that she's had a business legal relationship with John Reed. She failed to disclose this to any meetings I've attended. I think that's a problem. I don't know how she can support John Reed up here in this capacity and then hire John Reed if she paid him and maybe he was giving her free legal services. Whatever that relationship is, I don't have a clue, but I think someone needs to find out. She should have known better, and he should have known better. But neither of them have spoken about it. When reporters have asked, can you explain this to us? The answer was no return phone calls. Or, you better call her because I'm the attorney. This is wrong. She failed to disclose this, as I've mentioned. This ethics board needs to say no to Julie Meadow-Keefe, and you should remove her immediately from her position. You should say no to John Reed because he should have known better. But also, John Reed, there is a more independent, more experienced, more knowledgeable candidate who's willing to take this position. And you need to say yes to Phil Claypool. If you don't move to immediately remove her, and I doubt that you will, then I want to formally ask that this commission, that I'll file an ethics complaint, ask you to investigate and report to the public exactly what happened and why she still remains there in that position, which she, being the ethics officer, and every member up here should exemplify the highest of ethical standards, not the lowest. We leave that to Scott Maddox and that group, and we know where he's headed. I also have two documents. One that both of them came from the Tallahassee report that I also helped verify. The ethics board is to consider the council appointment again. Ethics officer failed to disclose personal ties to the board council, the applicant during this selection process. I want to make these part of the official minutes. Whoever gets those, I appreciate it.
I apologize to Ms. Meadows-Keefe. She actually had a statement that she was going to make before we got into all of this, and I did not give her the time. You could give those to
Lucy.
In terms of the selection, our attempted selection of Mr. Reed in February, Ms. Meadows-Keefe did not have a vote, does not have a vote in who we select as board attorney. And she and I have talked on several occasions over the last several months about her in discussions with individual board members not promoting or opposing any applicant for board member or for board attorney. That as she talked to you, our understanding was that she would provide whatever information you folks wanted or asked for or in terms of process, but that she would not weigh in on personal opinions on anyone that she might know or have an opinion about. In terms of her personal relationship with Mr. Reed, which he can't really speak to as an attorney, or probably shouldn't speak to, I can tell you that it was we're talking about one-time personal matters that occurred when he was not board attorney or applicant for board attorney, and for which he was fully compensated at a normal hourly rate. So I think lots of attorneys have lots of clients, and if you're prohibited from ever doing any business in relationship that in any way relates to anybody who you've ever had as a client in your history, you probably have some limitations on your ability to make a living. But that said, Ms. Meadows-Keefe did not, has not, and will not have a role in deciding who we select as board attorney. Just like she does not have a vote on what we recommend to the City Commission in terms of amendments. She does help with drafting and research, but I can tell you that I spend a lot of time looking at things and providing pretty specific direction on that stuff. So that said, any other comments? You're recognized.
Peter Butzine with the coalition. I stand before you not to oppose Mr. Reed. I have no disrespect for Mr. Reed. I made that clear at the last meeting. But rather to support Mr. Claypool. And I have never met Mr. Claypool. He hasn't come to me, or I think any of us, to solicit this. We're simply in favor of his candidacy because we think he's the best candidate for the position. And if you will engage with me a bit, I'd like to provide a bit of well-intentioned hyperbole. If this board is to be truly world-class, and I think that you're on the cusp of becoming truly world-class, I think you should be represented by a world-class counsel. And in the area of ethics law and litigation and understanding of decades of advisory opinions that the State Commission on Ethics has issued in its over 40 years of history, there is no one more qualified than Mr. Claypool, and I commend him to your consideration.
Questions?
Question, Mr. Chair. Are we going to proceed with the vote tonight? Okay, I just was curious.
I don't know. We're going to do whatever the members of the board want to do. I think we can proceed with some discussion.
Okay.
In terms, Ms. McNeil has had, well, one, does anybody have any comments at this point? Well, I'm not sure it's exactly fair to our new board member to ask him who he likes on the list of 8. But let me do this. Let me go to Mr. Smith first. We'll do kind of order of seniority, and we'll leave you to last. And you certainly feel free to pass on anything where you know you kind of got dropped in the boiling water here.
He's doing great.
Please, what?
He's doing fantastic.
Oh, he is. He is.
Doing fantastic. Right. Bianca's even better.
Well, I guess keeping in similar to how we did the council, picked out top 3. I think I did 2 the last time, but I had a top 3. And right now, just put them in alphabetical order, and I'll discuss my thoughts on them. I had Mr. Claypool, Mr. Currington, and Mr. Reed. Guess I'll go backwards. With Mr. Reed, I can honestly say, I've seen his work. We mentioned the meeting where he assisted us. I listened to his legal reasoning. I found him to be more than qualified. I've seen his legal writing. But then when I look at some other things, I see, based on his CV that he tendered, seems as when it comes to ethics, it seemed as if his partner, Judge Tamayo, I hope I'm pronouncing that, seemed to have a little bit more ethics experience. I do understand the concept of transferable skills. You don't have to always have a background in ethics to be able to reason and to write well and to present information. I did have some concern about the last part that he had in his bio when I just wrote it down again just so I won't forget it. Mr. Reed continues to maintain regular access to numerous members of the U.S. Congress and Florida legislature through his existing law practice. And I know persons have to earn a living, and you'll meet so many people along the way. That doesn't mean that you could be tainted in any way, but I feel if you have a lot of access to Congress members or Florida's legislators, that you probably have a lot of access, or they have access to you on a local level as well. So that would be some concern I might have. Doesn't mean that you necessarily can't do the job and do it with integrity. And so those are some of the things I noticed about Mr. Reed. Mr. Currington, I was not necessarily dissatisfied. I thought his legal writing and his reasoning was good. There is a sense of familiarity. However, I was concerned with the frequent suggestions on why we couldn't pursue a case. I kind of wish that he would have been a little bit more assertive in telling us why we should or how we could. So those are my issues with that. As far as Mr. Claypool, I don't even know what he looks like. The experience he here? Yeah. Okay. The experience, from what I read, seems to speak for itself. I was reminded when I was a third-year law student in Georgia, we had a third-year practice act, and so you could go practice in local courts. So I was working at the state court, and we had misdemeanors, and DUIs came through my office all the time. And I ran into a lot of went up against a lot of great DUI defense attorneys. But there was one in Georgia, Bubba Head, and he was the guru on DUI defense. He would even come to our prosecutors' meetings and retreats and trainings. And when he would come, when you had a case with someone in his office, there was a rumbling in our office, and we were prosecutors. And it was because you were dealing with the person who kind of wrote the book on this. And like I said, I ran into a lot of great defense attorneys, but if I had to pick one to represent me or a family member, I would kind of want the one who wrote the book on it. So that's what kind of drew me to the Claypool. I've seen someone, and no offense, based on his bio, started in ethics when I was 4, I think around 76, and has been doing this continuously. That kind of stood out to me. And the fact that we've actually used, or in the process of trying to use, some of his writings for our current work. So, I don't know, do you want, I'm a big football fan or basketball fan. I thought, do I want Phil Jackson, or do I want a person who coached under Phil Jackson? I want the person who created the thing. So that's just how I look at that. If I had to pick the three, I really think Claypool and Reed would be the best two from what I've seen, but I would just give the nod based on experience in this particular field of law or field of practice, Mr. Claypool.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to say to the advocates, and Dr. Jackson, are you part of the advocates? Because they sit over there together. Okay. That I appreciate all that you're doing. And in the short time that I have been on this board, I have come to see how much time, energy you devote to the Independent Ethics Board. I am keying in on that word independent. Yes, we are independent of the mayor, we are independent of the city commission, but we are independent. And I don't know Mr. Claypool. I don't know if we've met before. I apologize if we have. But I I don't actually think that this has done you a service by what I feel is a full court press to have you selected as the attorney. Because I think you will come in with a perception that you're not independent. And we need an attorney that is not influenced by anything other than the law, that's not influenced by anything other than giving us the best advice. I know I rely upon it. I rely upon it. So I apologize to Dr. Jackson. I apologize to the advocates for what I do think was a slip-up, because I would have liked to have known that there was a personal relationship or a business relationship between our ethics officer and Mr. Reed. But I know as an attorney myself that that is not information that he was probably free to divulge to me personally. And I could be wrong on that, but I'm just, as an attorney. I have seen Mr. Reed's work. I think he's done an excellent job. One of my goals on this board is to push us forward, to get things done so that we can have the ability to have substance and be a positive voice in ethics in the city of Tallahassee. As I led, I think you were here, Dr. Jackson, and the advocates, I know were here. I led my service on this board by saying that none of us should ever want to get on the front page of the Tallahassee Democrat, and we have a reporter sitting with us, for a reason that we would be embarrassed by. I hold myself to the highest ethics, highest integrity. And again, I believe that in this process, and it's not been an easy one, I don't think that Mr. Claypool has been well served. That's my opinion. So I'm going to support Mr. Reed, John Reed, as the next board attorney.
Okay. That would put us with Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am probably is something of a disadvantage to the rest of the board. I think I'm the only non-attorney up here now since Ms. Beal left. I do have some experience working with attorneys. I spent 17 years with the state division. That was a very litigious division. What we did was we acted as receiver for insurance companies that were insolvent. So as you might imagine, there was a lot of litigation involved in that. I had to work directly with them. I advised them on technical issues, the various attorneys. So I had a good feeling. I definitely had my opinions on what made a good attorney and what did not. And that's about all I can bring to this endeavor right now. I certainly was able to evaluate the written work product of our attorneys, and I definitely have an opinion. I'm something of a wordsmith myself, so I'm very sensitive to that kind of thing. In looking at I've examined the writing of Mr. Claypool and Mr. Reed that he's produced for us that we've gone over tonight. The only document I've looked at for Mr. Claypool was what he evidently produced for Dr. Jackson several years ago. My top three that I had listed was John Reed, Phil Claypool, and Gerald Currington, and that was simply because of Mr. Currington's experience on the board itself. I really don't have any strong opinion. I watched him on video a few times, but that's about it. My feeling was that John Reed did an excellent job in putting together the material that we've been going over tonight. So I would strongly support him. Mr. Claypool obviously has a stellar resume, and so I basically I'm going back and forth between the two. But my comments would be Mr. Reed and Mr. Claypool as our top two.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
I know it's not on the table yet, but we had talked about some bifurcated opportunities so that Mr. Claypool's experience would not be missed by this
We did, at the last meeting, decide that we would like, if Mr. Claypool was not the board attorney, that we would like to have him review our product in terms of these recommendations and future recommendations concerning ordinances and such. And we do need to keep some attorney somewhere in our back pocket concerning future complaints where we need effectively a prosecutor. Those are situations that come up very quickly. We have very little notice. We don't have time to hold an intervening board meeting to decide who we want to hire. It's going to be whoever's chair is just going to have to say, pull the trigger, get this person in here. We got to roll on this ethics complaint.
I just think that would be good information for our newest 2 board members to have as well.
And Mr. Chair, I want to update you on a task that you gave me at the last meeting.
Let me finish going through. Ms. Graywell. First meeting, lucky you.
I didn't have the benefit of knowing a lot of what was done previously on this board, and so a lot of the decision-making I've had is just by coming to the last meeting, as well as the resumes, the cover letters, everything that has been sent to me. I did not know a lot about, and I still actually do not know a lot about the work that Mr. Currington did. He was definitely one of my top 3 independently, not based upon the work that he had done, which I, quite frankly, again, I don't know about, but just the sheer experience that he brings and diversity of experience that he brings, I was impressed by that. With Mr. Claypool, I will echo what Ms. Graham has said, that it comes across as, and I don't want to use the word off-putting, I cannot think of another synonym. I do not have thesaurus.com with me, very much millennial, and I use thesaurus.com all the time. But the way I will say is that when you have someone or a group of people really pushing someone, it feels a little bit like you're being very pushed about a particular candidate. That being said, Mr. Claypool is also one of the other top 3, not because of the kind words that everyone has said, but simply because I did appreciate his cover letter and what he had to say. So in that regard, he is one of my top 3, but I will say that kind of the joint push was a little bit of a detraction from that. The only experience that I have with Mr. Reed is the helpfulness that he did in helping put together the memorandum, the drafting that he has done. I also very much appreciated in a personal capacity of Mr. Reed reaching out to me to explain any of the drafting that had gone on, which as a new board member, I appreciated. I will say that, of course, is a benefit that Mr. Reed has had simply because he is in this position right now. But based on that experience, I have appreciated what he has put together. And so I will also say that without having Ms. McNeil here, I would prefer just to avoid any issues that we've had previously, to have a full board do the voting. I understand that that puts everything back another month, and that being said, to avoid any sense of impropriety or anything like that, I would prefer to have an entire board do the vote so that we can say that it was either unanimous or at least a full vote.
Okay, I can tell you I have kind of the same bias that I would like to have all 7 of us here when we make the decision. Mr. Ray, do you want to comment? Or if we were to push this decision to next month, you would actually have a chance to look at applications as opposed to cold turkey here.
Yeah, at this point, I would withhold my vote just to not do a disservice to this board.
Okay.
I just like to echo my disagreement with that, but I will go with the will of the board. I just think it's time we start making decisions and moving forward, and we do have a quorum, do we not?
We would have 5 people voting.
Is that?
Because I think Mr. Ray is not in a position to
Oh, so he wouldn't.
He hasn't even reviewed the application, so it's asking a lot to make him
So we
sign
would
on
not
the
have
dotted
a
line.
quorum if we're not
We
included.
would have 4 as a quorum. We would have 5. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, I apologized to you before because I know you had a statement that you were going to make concerning your past employment of Mr. Reed. Would you like to make that statement or not?
It's a very brief statement.
Please go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to disclose that I've known Ms. Tamayo since 2007 when she was general counsel at Department of Health. She was my boss, and she's become someone that I'm acquainted with and would consider a friend, and that is not an impediment in any way, and I never advocated for her. In terms of Mr. Reed, I have engaged his services on a limited basis on 2 separate occasions. Both matters were completed when bids were reviewed and when this last round of selection took place. The task I received from the board chair, both during the bid solicitation process, which we did at the behest of the chair listening to the advocates. I served on that selection committee, and the board chair said, send out this RFQ to attorneys in the community that you believe are qualified. So I sent these requests out to the wide legal community, to those people that I knew, and some of them I did not know at all, but saw that they had an expertise in ethics, and we got applications back. And the first product of that selection process was Attorney Marstiller. So Mr. Reed did not receive that contract at that time. I was on that selection committee, as was Mr. Butzine and Ms. Sunny Phillips, a former member of this board. So Mr. Reed did not get that contract, and my ranking of him did not reflect him probably in the top 3, I'm sorry. But no, that's what occurred. And this last time, the board chair asked me to basically do the same process. We knew Mr. Claypool was interested. We knew Mr. Upton was interested. Anyone that expressed interest was sent a letter saying, please submit, a resume and cover letter, and you'll be considered. So the services that I had for Mr. Reed were limited in scope, had been disclosed to the chair, and since they were closed and they are personal to me, weren't mine to feel like I needed to discuss publicly. The second thing is that the board chair at the last meeting asked me to reach out to Mr. Claypool based on his expertise and the respect that he's got from so many people, and ask him to consult on making the recommendations to the city commission. I reached out through that phone call. He was actually supposed to be looped in this time for the review of recommendations, but we got up against a time crunch trying to get these completed. I did reach out to him this week and say, regardless of the outcome today, we would like for him to be a consultant on finalizing the language that you all reviewed today at the meeting. So that was at the instruction of the chair, and I did do that, and unless the chair directs otherwise, I think we may plan to do that.
Okay, thank you. Comments?
You're probably not going to be surprised, Mr. Chair, that I have a comment. I am okay with delaying the vote till the next ethics board meeting. Can we review as board members the minutes and the comments that were made, or are we going to open the entire process back up to more public comments on the attorney, or are we just going to come and we're going to vote and move forward from that point? I think out of fairness to Mr. Claypool and Mr. Reed, delaying this another month, I mean, it's obviously become somewhat of a controversial issue here. It's going to be a difficult month. So So I think we need to short-circuit this as much as we can, Mr. Chair.
It would be my intent, absent the board wanting to go a different direction, to my three would be Mr. Claypool, Mr. Currington, Mr. Reed, as they were in our February non-meeting. Because we have two members, one of whom isn't necessarily ready to go tonight and one of whom is definitely not ready to go tonight, and an absent member, that's 3 of the 7. I think I would be the fourth to say, let's wait until next month. Let's limit our discussion only to the 3 people who have been mentioned at all out of the 8. Sorry, I had to count here. And that we would pick off, Ms. McNeil can review the video, see where we are, whatever discussion she's missed, and that we would pick off at this point, and we would just come in, have our discussion, unless there is some new information that becomes available to us between now and then that we have not heard about, that we wouldn't be re-engaging in a new discussion. We would come in, ask if there's anything new, ask if any board members have any additional comments they want to make, and vote. In the interim, I'd like to ask Mr. Claypool and Mr. Reed if they would both engage with us in the public forum and in completing the drafting of our recommendations and the alternative, the 5 or 6 or 7 alternative pieces that we have to draft. So does anybody object? I know, Ms. Graham, that's not where you would like to be, but
No, it's fine. I mean, I understand the reason behind it. I'm of the mind that another month is quite a long time, and that
it is.
My goal is to move this board forward, but I understand the rationale behind it, Mr. Chair, and I respect your chairmanship very much.
Mr. Payne?
I just wanted to, I guess, make a reminder that we talked about a workshop and the attendance by Mr. Reed at that time. Is there?
Well, I would invite both Mr. Reed and Mr. Claypool, and they can bill us hourly for their time. We don't, at this point, we don't have a contract with Mr. Reed. We have a draft contract that both sides have reviewed, but it is not signed. And so they effectively we're on an hour by hour basis. Mr. Smith?
Mr. Claypool had it.
Mr. Claypool, you're recognized. I'm sorry.
The man of the hour.
Look, Mr. Claypool wants to save us money and asks if that's okay. I'm going to say yes. Yes, that would be. I had assumed it would be at the rate that you had proposed in your application. So, Mr. Claypool, why don't you come to the microphone, because we're losing all of this, and I want to make sure that Ms. McNeil has access to this discussion.
Okay. Hi, I'm Phil Claypool, and you read my background and all of that. If I were on the board, I would be reluctant to hire 2 attorneys to do the work that needs to be done. If you want my services, I'm happy to participate. I think it's an extremely worthwhile function. That's the only reason I'm here. And so if I can help, I'd be happy to help. If it's working, at a public meeting, helping with drafting behind the scenes, raising legal issues, talking about constitutionality of this and that and the other, so that you've got a good product and good alternatives before you at the next board. I've represented people in your position for 35 years, people who are volunteers from their community, aren't getting paid, but believe government should be done right. And so I know you all believe in that as well. And to me, that would be one way of getting that, because you do need to move ahead. You already said that. And if you want my advice, I'd be happy to participate that way. if that creates some problems with anybody else, I'll step back. It's your decision. You're the board. You would be the client.
Yeah, I think we discussed this at the last meeting about involving you in drafting not only these recommendations, but recommendations in the future, regardless of how all of this selection of board attorney, if I quit pounding on the microphone, plays out. But we'd like to have you involved at this stage. And if we're paying two people, I think we, given the importance of this issue, this will probably be the biggest single request that we will make to the City Commission, potentially in the lifetime of this board, and whatever resources we devote to it, I think are well spent, personally. And I think the board at the last meeting decided that your participation was more than worth it to us. So we'd be happy to have you. Again, I think having you in a meeting, in a public forum with some of the folks here in the room will also help, so that they feel certain that we are bringing your along with whatever expertise other folks in the room may have, we're bringing your long history into play as we respond to whatever comments they may have. I think that's going to give folks on the non-government folks a level of confidence. So with that said, Mr. Reed, is there anything you'd like to say at this point? Okay.
I think we have one issue that we haven't sort of come back to, and out of respect for our ethics officer, I think we need to have another opportunity in a public forum to discuss the role of the ethics officer. I feel like the board right now, someone used the word cusp. I'm not sure who used the word cusp, but we are at the cusp of moving forward in a very positive way, and I don't want to leave something hanging out there regarding the ethics officer that needs to be addressed, where we can all talk about it and not be violating any sunshine laws. So I don't know what that is or how we do that, but I would recommend that we as a board decide how to accomplish that goal.
I think that's sage advice, and we'll figure out how we can structure that. I suspect we will have to do it in a public meeting, which means we will have to be gentle probably on some issues that we discuss. If it turns out to be something that we need to go in the sunshine, I will tell you, before I recognize you, Dr. Jackson, that in terms of the issues that Dr. Jackson raised, most of them would not be within our current jurisdiction. The one issue that would be within our current jurisdiction would involve not Ms. Meadows-Keefe, but a former city official. Would be the nature of the complaint and the way that we would have to deal with that complaint. So that's kind of where we stand. You're recognized, Dr. Jackson.
I just wanted to make sure that my complaint did get formally recognized, and if you've got to look over here to get over there, she's an employee of yours, and I think you're responsible for that employee. So to say that you don't, that she's your responsibility, this is a problem. I want to have it addressed in an ethics complaint because she represents this entire board, and this entire board represents all of us.
Right.
So thank you.
And my response is I'm not sure that an ethics complaint is something that we can respond to. The employee-employer relationship, as Ms. Graham has said, is certainly something that we can look at, and we will get it.
Well, if you're telling me I have to make a complaint, I'll make a complaint because they're both city employees. So if our
jurisdiction doesn't extend to city employees; it extends to appointed and elected officials.
Okay.
So
then we can certainly then do the ethics complaint regarding the appointed official, if that's how we have to do it. Because no matter if you're looking at two people and you're looking at this is a person you can look at regarding something that took place, what is that relationship? That's what I want to have exposed. We got to do better. Is my only point.
I think Ms. Graham's solution is a more direct way to deal with the issue you raise. I would just, not that I try to give people advice, because I know that's a bad idea, but
I think if you have a complaint against an appointed official, it needs to be brought here, then I want something in writing that you've refused to address it. You know, I just want to file the complaint.
Okay.
And then you can type up a letter saying that you refuse to address it.
Dr. Jackson, from this board, I, as a board member, have recommended that we engage in an appropriate meeting that will allow our ethics officer to be a part of that meeting and quite honestly, address some of these issues so that the community has confidence in us as a board and in our ethics officer.
That may be a good first start. We'll see what happens.
Yay!
Thank you.
Okay.
okay, so we're doing that preliminary to you maybe filing a formal ethics complaint. Is that where we are? I'm trying to decide if you are filing a complaint right now, if that is your intent.
I'm leaving. I'm going home, go take a sleep on it tonight, but I want it exposed, and I'm not exactly for sure what you're talking about, the details. I'll learn more about your details. If I get to where I want to go and the public, is advised of what's taking place, then I'm going to be happy.
That's good, Dr. Jackson.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. With that, does everybody understand where we are? Oh, are you guys, I'm sorry, I was going down the row. Ms. Graywall, are you okay with coming back next meeting? This is going to be first thing on the agenda, and we're going to...
Yeah, it's a little bit like Ms. Graham said, that we are moving forward, so I want to ensure that our ethics officer has an opportunity to talk in a future situation. It builds the confidence, and that is part of the reason I recommended that the entire board is here to vote, because I don't want there any more issues for anyone in Tallahassee to not have confidence in our board.
Okay, and Mr. Ray?
I agree.
Okay. We have agreement with that. We are 43 minutes over. We are adjourned. Note that our next meeting is April 16th, which is a Tuesday, from 4 to 7 in this location. And we will schedule a public hearing to which we will notice, and you guys will be invited. You do not need to feel compelled to attend a public meeting, not a public hearing, a public meeting. But we will not, we will not make any decisions at that. We will take input, and we will consider alternatives that we may be able to present before the board for decision. With that, we're adjourned.